Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. I should have known better than to trust strangers in the woods. But when you've been hiking alone for days, any friendly face seems like a godsend. That's what I told myself when I met them, 4 locals with easy smiles and a secret spot they were dying to show me. I never imagined those smiles would be the last thing I'd see before my world turned upside down. The Appalachian Trail had been my escape, my way of clearing my head after a messy breakup and an even messier job loss. 3 days in, my legs ached. My backpack felt heavier with each step, but my mind was finally quiet. The rhythmic crunch of leaves under my boots and the whisper of wind through the trees had become a soothing melody, drowning out the noise of my troubled thoughts. I was taking a breather at a trail junction, consulting my map, when I heard voices approaching. 2 men and 2 women rounded the bend, laughing and chatting like old friends out for a stroll. They looked like locals, flannel shirts, worn jeans, and hiking boots that had seen better days. The oldest of the bunch, a man with salt and pepper hair and crow's feet around his eyes, gave me a friendly wave. "Hey, there, hiker taking on the solo, huh?" His voice was warm, with a hint of a southern drawl. I nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since I'd spoken to another person. "Yeah, just me." In the trail, the man introduced himself as Ray and made quick introductions for the others, Mike, Sash, and Lisa. They asked about my hike, where I was from. The usual small talk. It felt nice, normal even to chat with people again. "You know," Ray said, leaning in conspiratorially, "if you're looking for a real view, we know a spot just off the trail. Most hikers miss it, 'cause it ain't on the maps." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stick to the marked trail, to not follow strangers into the woods. But they seemed so genuine, so eager to share their local knowledge. And wasn't this what hiking was about? Discovering hidden gems, experiencing nature off the beaten path. "It's not far," Sarah chimed in, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe half an hour tops. The view of the valley is breathtaking, especially this time of year, with the leaves changing." I found myself nodding before I could think better of it. Sure, why not lead the way? We set off, leaving the well-worn trail behind. Ray took the lead, with Mike bringing up the rear. Sarah and Lisa flanked me, chatting amiably about the area's history and pointing out interesting plants along the way. At first we followed a faint path, barely more than a game trail, but as we pressed deeper into the woods, even that disappeared. The forest grew denser, the canopy above, blocking out more and more sunlight. The friendly chatter of the group gradually died down, replaced by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. I tried to keep track of our route, but the trees all started to look the same and I lost my sense of direction. A nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right. The half-hour mark came and went, and still we pressed on. The incline grew steeper, the underbrush thicker, my legs burned with the effort, and I had to use my hands to push aside branches that seemed to grab at my clothes. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Ray glanced back at me, his earlier warmth replaced by a cool appraising. "Look, not far now. You're not getting tired, are you?" There was something in his tone, a hint of mockery perhaps, that sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile. "No, just curious." We continued on in silence. I noticed the others had spread out, forming a loose circle around me every time I slowed or changed direction slightly. One of them was there, subtly hurting me back on course. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was being corralled, my heart began to race and I felt sweat beating on my forehead, despite the cool air. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize the situation. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the secret spot really was just ahead. But as we entered a small clearing, I knew in my bones that I had made a terrible mistake. There was no breathtaking view, no valley spread out before us, just a small unremarkable space surrounded by dense forest. Ray stopped and turned to face me, and the others closed ranks, forming a tight circle. "Well," Ray said, his voice no longer friendly, "looks like we made it." I spun around looking for a gap, an escape route, but found none. They had positioned themselves perfectly, cutting off any chance of flight. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. despite my efforts to sound strong. "Where's the view you promised?" Mike, who had barely spoken during the hike, let out a low chuckle. "Oh, there's a view, all right, just not the one you were expecting." Sarah stepped closer, her earlier warmth replaced by a predatory gleam in her eyes. "You really shouldn't have come with us," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But then again, they never learn, do they?" My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who were these people? What did they want? The weight of my backpack suddenly felt suffocating and I shrugged it off, ready to run if I saw even the slightest opening. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what's going on here, but I don't want any trouble. Just let me go and I'll forget this ever happened." RY stepped forward, closing the distance between us. He was close enough now that I could smell his breath, a mix of coffee and something metallic. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Trouble found you the moment you stepped off that trail." In that instant I knew I had to act or die. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung my backpack as hard as I could, catching Ray square in the chest. He stumbled backward, surprise, replacing the smug look on his face. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I ran crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about direction or stealth. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those people as possible. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I kept moving behind me. I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. They knew these woods had the advantage of numbers, but I had the desperate energy of someone fighting for their life. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't dare stop. The forest all looked the same, endless trees and undergrowth, with no sign of the trail or civilization. As the adrenaline began to wear off, panic set in. I was lost alone in unfamiliar woods with no supplies and no idea which direction would lead me to safety. For all I knew, I was running deeper into their territory. The sun was setting, the forest growing darker by the minute. I knew I couldn't keep running blindly. I needed to find shelter to hide and catch my breath. A fallen tree caught my eye, its massive trunk and upturned roots, creating a natural hollow. I crawled into the space, pressing myself as far back as I could. The earthy smell of decaying leaves filled my nostrils as I tried to quiet my ragged breathing. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of terror through me. As full darkness descended, the forest came alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals, but underlying it all was a tense silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I don't know how long I huddled there, shivering from cold and fear. My mind conjured terrifying images. Ray and his group finding me, dragging me out of my hiding place. What would they do to me? Why had they lured me out here at some point? Exhaustion must have overtaken me, because I jolted awake to the sound of voices. Distant at first, but growing closer, I held my breath, pressing myself further into my hiding spot. She couldn't have gotten far. I heard Ray's voice closer than I would have liked. "Fan out and keep looking. She's got to be around here somewhere." Footsteps crunched through the leaves, pausing every so often. I could hear them searching, calling out to each other as they combed the area. My heart was pounding so loudly. I was sure they would hear it. A beam of light swept over my hiding place and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to become invisible. The footsteps came closer, leaves crunching just in from where I lay. "Hey, RY," Mike's voice called out. "I think I found something over here." The footsteps moved away and I allowed myself to breathe again, but I knew I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before they found me. As their voices grew more distant, I steeled myself for what I had to do. I had to move, had to find my way out of these woods before they circled back. Crawling out from my hiding spot, I oriented myself as best I could in the darkness. The moon provided just enough light to make out shapes, but not much more. I picked a direction and started moving, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every step was a terror. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, but I pressed on, driven by the knowledge that staying still meant certain capture. I don't know how long I walked or how far time lost all meaning in the dark forest, but eventually, miraculously, I saw a faint glow through the trees, civilization stumbling out onto a road. I flagged down the first car I saw. The elderly couple inside looked shocked at my appearance, scratched, dirty and wildy, but they took me to the nearest police station where I poured out my story. The police searched the area but found no trace of RY or the others, no evidence of the clearing where they had trapped me. It was as if they had vanished into the forest itself. I never went back to finish my hike. The Appalachian Trail, once a source of solace, now featured prominently in my nightmares. But sometimes on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I wonder about those woods and I shudder knowing that somewhere out there, Ray and his group are probably looking for their next unsuspecting hiker to lead astray. The silence was supposed to be peaceful. Instead it became a canvas for terror, painting my solitude with brushstrokes of paranoia and dread. What began as a simple weekend getaway spiraled into a nightmare that still haunts me, leaving me to question the very nature of solitude and the unseen forces that lurk in the quiet corners of the world. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The stress of city life, the constant dent of traffic and the suffocating pressure of deadlines had worn me down to a nub when I stumbled across the listing for a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods. It seemed like the perfect escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me and the great outdoors, a chance to reset, to find myself again in the quiet of nature. The drive up was beautiful, the road winding through dense forests and alongside babbling streams. As I turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, the trees seemed to close in around me, creating a natural tunnel that led to my weekend sanctuary. The cabin itself was charming in its rustic simplicity, a small wooden structure with a covered porch. It looked like something out of a storybook. I parked my car, grabbed my bags and took a deep breath of the crisp pine-scented air. Already I could feel the tension in my shoulders starting to ease. Inside the cabin was cozy and well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a small kitchenette tucked into the corner. The bedroom was snug, with a window that looked out into the surrounding forest. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly what I needed. I spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking my groceries and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. There was a small, clear in out back, perfect for stargazing, and a well-worn path that led down to a creek. As the sun began to set, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled into an armchair with a book and a glass of wine. The silence was profound, no cars, no distant sirens, not even the hum of electronics, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I reveled in it, feeling the last vestiges of city stress melting away. It was close to midnight when I finally decided to turn in. I banked the fire, made sure the doors were locked more out of habit than any real concern, and crawled into bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and I drifted off almost immediately, lulled by the absolute quiet. I'm not sure what woke me, a sound, maybe, or just that inexplicable sense that something wasn't right. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding, straining my ears for a long moment. There was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic, crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. My first thought was that it must be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon foraging around the cabin. But as I listened, the footsteps seemed too deliberate, too measured to be an animal. They circled the cabin, slowly, pausing occasionally, before continuing on. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent, on the wooden floor, moving to the window. I peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued, now on the far side of the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I thought about the isolation that had seemed so appealing just hours before now. It felt oppressive, dangerous. I crept to the main room, checking the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, just as I had left it. The footsteps completed their circuit of the cabin and fell silent. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. All the unfamiliar sounds of the forest playing tricks on my city-trained ears. I laughed softly at my own paranoia and went back to bed. Morning came bright and clear. I awoke feeling refreshed, the unsettling events of the night fading like a bad dream in the light of day. I made coffee and decided to enjoy it on the porch, soaking in the beauty of the forest. As I stepped outside, my mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the wooden planks. There in the center of the clearing was a small pile of rocks, 5 or 6 stones stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there yesterday, I was sure of it. My mind raced. Had someone been here while I slept? But why leave a pile of rocks? It seemed so odd, so purposeless. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me. But it was just rocks, cold and inert in the morning sun. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I hiked down to the creek, splashed in the cold water, and even managed to spot a deer grazing in a distant meadow. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the rock pile. Maybe the property owner had been by to check on things and decided to indulge in some impromptu rock stacking. As darkness fell, I found myself growing tense again. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of leaves outside seemed magnified. I built another fire, hoping its warm glow would dispel the shadows that seemed to lurk in every corner. I must have dozed off in the armchair, because the next thing I knew I was jolting awake to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door, clear and unmistakable. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence, heavy and oppressive. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The knocking came again, this time from the back door. I whirled around, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I lunged for my phone, forgetting for a moment that there was no service out here. My hands shook as I tried to dial 911 anyway, praying for a miracle. Nothing. The screen mockingly displayed no signal, as another series of knocks echoed through the cabin, this time from the bedroom window. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it out in front of me like a sword. "I'm armed," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave me alone." The knocking stopped for a long moment. There was no sound, but my own ragged breathing. Then, softly at first, but growing louder, I heard laughter. It seemed to come from all around the cabin. A chorus of mocking chuckles that made my blood run cold. I backed into a corner, the poker clutched to my chest, and waited. The laughter faded, replaced once again by that awful silence. I don't know how long I stood there, every muscle tense, expecting at any moment for the doors to burst open. But nothing happened. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever had been out there, it seemed to have gone exhausted and terrified. I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Surrounding the cabin, spaced evenly about 10 feet apart, were more of those rock piles, dozens of them, each one identical to the one I had found the day before. I didn't bother packing. I just grabbed my keys and ran for my car. As I sped down the gravel driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror for a split second. I thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the trees watching me go, but when I looked again there was nothing there. I drove straight to the local police station, my story tumbling out in a frantic jumble. They were kind but skeptical. They took my statement and promised to check out the cabin, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't really believe me when they called a few days later. Their report was frustratingly mundane. They had found no evidence of intruders, no footprints, and no rock piles. The cabin was exactly as it should be, peaceful and undisturbed in it, forest clearing. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was stress or an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies, but in my heart I know what I experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods, something that toyed with me for reasons I'll never understand. I've never gone back to that cabin, or any cabin for that matter. The peace and solitude I once craved now feel like an invitation to unknown terrors. Sometimes on quiet nights I find myself listening for footsteps, for knocking, for that mocking laughter, and I wonder with a shiver of fear if whatever was in those woods has followed me home. The rock piles haunt my dreams, a simple arrangement of stones that has become a symbol of an encounter I can neither fully explain nor forget. They stand as silent sentinels in my nightmares, reminding me that sometimes the most terrifying things are those that leave no trace, save for the indelible mark they leave on our psyche. The moment I stepped out of my car, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was thick, with an eerie stillness broken only by the soft tick of my cooling engine. I should have kept driving, should have trusted my gut, but I didn't, and that decision nearly cost me everything. It was supposed to be a simple drive home, a 4-hour stretch of highway. I'd traveled countless times before, but as night fell and the miles ticked by, exhaustion began to set in, the white lines on the road started to blur and I caught myself nodding off more than once. I needed to stop just for a moment to shake off the fatigue and clear my head. That's when I saw it, a pile of debris blocking the road ahead. Logs, branches and what looked like chunks of concrete were strewn across both lanes. I slowed to a stop, my headlights illuminating the obstacle. It was odd there hadn't been any construction signs, no warnings of road worker, just this sudden impassable barrier in the middle of nowhere. I put the car in park and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my feet. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no distant rumble of traffic, just the soft whisper of wind through the trees that lined the road. As I approached the debris, something felt off. The arrangement seemed too deliberate, too carefully placed to be the result of a landslide or fallen tree. The logs were stacked, the branches intertwined in a way that spoke of human intervention. I glanced back at my car, then, down the road in both directions, no other vehicles in sight, just me, my car and this inexplicable roadblock. I pulled out my phone hoping to call for help, but the screen mocked me with its no service CER message, of course. Why would anything be easy? I sighed, realizing I'd have to move some of this stuff myself if I wanted to get through. As I bent to grab the end of a log, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of my headlights, reach was a set of footprints leading off into the woods. My heart skipped a beat, fresh footprints, the disturbed earth still settling. Someone had been here, and recently I straightened up suddenly, very aware of how exposed I was. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting the decision. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vast darkness. No response came, but I could have sworn. I heard a twig snap somewhere in the shadows beyond the road. I should have gotten back in my car right then, should have turned around and driven away as fast as I could. But curiosity, that damned human trait, got the better of me. I took a few steps toward the tree line, squinting to see further into the darkness. That's when I heard it. The low rumble of an engine relief washed over me. Another car was approaching. I wasn't alone out here after all. I turned back toward the road, ready to flag down the driver and ask for help. But my relief was short-lived. There, idling about 50 yards behind my car, was a truck. Its headlights were off, the engine purring quietly. I hadn't heard it pull up, hadn't seen any lights approaching. It was as if it had materialized out of the darkness. "Hey," I called out, waving my arms. "Can you help me? The road's blocked." The truck didn't move. I couldn't make out the driver through the windshield, just a dark silhouette behind the wheel. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I started walking back to my car, trying to keep my pace steady, despite the panic rising in my chest. The truck's driver's side door opened, with a creak that seemed to echo in the still night air. A man stepped out, tall and broad, shouldered his features, hidden in shadow. "Need some help?" His voice was deep, casual, but there was an undercurrent to it. That, said, set my teeth on edge. I stopped my hand on my car door handle. Yeah, there's a bunch of debris blocking the road. I was just about to try and clear it. He started walking toward me. His gait, slow and deliberate, nasty business that happens sometimes out here. Folks aren't careful about what they're carrying. As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was wearing a thick jacket. Despite the mild weather, his hands shoved deep in the pocket. A baseball cap pulled low obscured most of his face. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "Now, just a few feet away, never know what kind of trouble you might run into." My heart was pounding so hard. I was sure he could hear it. Every instinct was screaming at me to get in the car and drive debris. Be damned, but he was too close. Now if I made a move, he'd be on me before I could close the door. I'm fine, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. My husband is expecting me. He'll be worried if I'm late. The man chuckled, a low sound that sent shivers down my spine. Is that so funny? I didn't see a ring on your finger when you were waving your arms about. Earlier ice flooded my veins. He'd been watching me. For how long had he been there? When I first pulled up. Look, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. I don't want any trouble. Why don't you go on ahead? I'll figure out how to get around this mess. He took another step closer. I could smell him now, a mixture of cigarette smoke and something metallic. Oh, I don't think you'll be going anywhere for a while. That's when I heard it. Movement in the woods behind me, more than one person by the sound of it, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the full extent of the trap I'd walked into. The man smiled, and in the dim light I saw the glint of teeth. Like I said, folks aren't careful about what they're carrying out here. Sometimes things fall off trucks, sometimes those things are valuable, and sometimes, well, sometimes we need to make sure no one interrupts while we collect our lost property. I didn't think, I just acted. In one fluid motion I yanked open my car door and threw myself inside. The man lunged forward, his hand grasping for my arm, but I slammed the door shut just in time. His fist pounded on the window. As I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly, I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as more men emerged from the woods, 3 of them running toward my car with purposeful strides. I threw the car into reverse tires, squealing as I backed up the man who had spoken to me. Dove out of the way, rolling across the asphalt. I spun the wheel, the car fishtailing. As I turned it around in my rearview mirror, I saw the men running back to the truck. The engine gunned to life, headlights flaring in the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I slammed on the gas, my car lurching forward. The debris loomed ahead, but I didn't slow down. I aimed for the section that looked least dense and prayed. The impact was jarring. My teeth rattled as the car bounced and scraped over the logs and branches. Something cracked underneath, probably my oil pan. A distant part of my mind supplied, but the car kept moving. I was through. The road ahead was clear, and I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck was behind me now, its headlights growing larger. In my mirror they were gaining on me, my damaged car. No match for their truck on this straight stretch of highway. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think, needed to find a way out of this nightmare. Up ahead I saw a turnoff, a narrow road that disappeared into the woods. It was risky. I had no idea where it led, but staying on the main road wasn't an option. I waited until the last second, then wrenched the wheel to the right. My car skidded, tires screeching as I made the turn. The truck blew past the turnoff. Unable to slow down in time, I had bought myself a few precious seconds. The road was rough, more dirt than pavement. My car rattled and shook, but I didn't dare slow down. Trees whipped past on either side, branches scraping against the windows. I drove blindly, taking turns at random, praying. I was putting distance between myself and my pursuers. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw lights ahead, a gas station. Its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope. In the darkness, I screeched into the parking lot, horn blaring, and threw myself out of the car. The attendant looked startled as I burst through the door, wild-eyed and babbling about men chasing me. He called the police while I huddled behind the counter, jumping at every sound. When the cops arrived, they found no sign of the truck or the men. They drove me back to the scene, but the debris was gone, the road clear, as if nothing had ever happened. They were sympathetic but skeptical. No evidence, no crime. I sold my car soon after that night, couldn't stand to look at it with its dents and scrapes, reminding me of how close I'd come to. I don't even know what. I don't drive that road anymore, don't drive much at all if I can help it. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that man's smile, still hear the sound of footsteps in the woods, and I wonder with a shudder how many others have fallen for that trap on that lonely stretch of road. How many weren't as lucky as I was? So if you're driving late at night and you come across a blocked road in the middle of nowhere, don't stop, don't get out of your car, just turn around and drive away as fast as you can, because you never know who might be waiting in the darkness, ready to spring a trap. You may not escape the woods, have eyes. I know that now what I thought would be a peaceful solo camping trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. The rustling leaves, the snapping twigs, the whispers in the dark, they weren't just the sounds of nature, they were warnings I should have heed. I'd always been the outdoorsy type, but life had a way of getting in the way. Work, relationships, the usual culprits when everything fell apart, lost my job, broke up with my long-term girlfriend. I decided it was time to reconnect with nature. Clear my head, find myself again, all that cliché stuff you hear about in self-help books. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest town, the kind of place where you can really feel alone with your thoughts. I packed light, just a tent sleeping bag, some basic supplies and enough food for a couple of days. The plan was simple, hike in, set up camp and spend a few days soaking in the solitude. The hike was beautiful. Late autumn had painted the forest in rich golds and deep reds. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As I walked, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. I found the perfect spot. Just as the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, a small clearing near a babbling stream, sheltered by towering pines. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood and settled in for the evening. That first night was everything I'd hoped for. I sat by the fire watching the flames dance as the stars emerged overhead. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft gurgle of the stream. For the first time in months I felt at peace. I must have dozed off by the fire, because the next thing I knew I was jolting awake to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the clearing. I blinked disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me then. I heard it, a rustling sound just at the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that it must be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon foraging for food. But as I listened, I realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. Footsteps, slow, measured footsteps circling the perimeter of the clearing. My heart began to race. I sat perfectly still, straining my eyes to see into the darkness. Beyond the dying firelight, the footsteps continued their circuit, never hurrying, never slowing. Just a steady, relentless pace. Hello. I called out my voice, sounding thin and scared in the night air. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I waited, every muscle tense, for something to happen. Nothing did. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. All the unfamiliar sounds of the forest playing tricks on my city-trained ears. I laughed softly at my own paranoia and retreated to my tent. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually I drifted off. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I stepped out of my tent, stretching and yawning, ready to shake off the unsettling events of the night. That's when I saw it. There, just a few feet from where I had been sleeping, was a symbol scratched into the dirt, a crude circle with a line drawn through it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't here. Yesterday someone or something had been in my camp. While I slept, I approached the symbol cautiously, as if it might suddenly spring to life. The line was deep, clearly carved with purpose. This was no random scratch in the dirt. This was a message. My eyes darted around the clearing, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The trees that had seemed so welcoming yesterday now loomed ominously, their shadows, concealing who knows what. That's when I saw him or it, I'm still not sure. Just beyond the tree line, partially hidden behind a massive pine, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and unnaturally thin, its skin, if you could call it. That seemed to shift and ripple, blending with the dappled shadows of the forest. We low eyes, or at least I think we did. Where its face should have been was a void, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it. I felt a primal fear grip me, the kind of terror our ancestors must have felt when, faced with the unknown predators of a primeval world. I blinked and it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen. The image was burned into my mind. A nightmare made flesh. My hands shaking, I began to break camp. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I felt eyes on me watching from the forest, but every time I looked up, there was nothing there. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard a whisper so faint I almost missed it. Carried on the breeze like a sigh. Stay. I froze, the sleeping bag clutched to my chest like a shield. The words seemed to echo in my head, growing louder with each repetition. Stay, stay, stay. No. I said aloud, my voice cracking. No, I'm leaving right now. I threw my things haphazardly into my backpack, no longer caring about neatness or organization. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself in this place as possible. As I shouldered my pack and turned to leave, I saw them, dozens of those symbols carved into the trunks of the trees surrounding the clearing, circles with lines through them, some fresh, the bark still oozing sap, others old and weathered. How had I not noticed them before I ran? I didn't care about following the trail or finding my way back. My only thought was escape. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. My lungs burned, my legs HDHD, but the fear pushing me forward was stronger than any physical discomfort. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. In that forest the trees all looked the same, and more than once I feared I was running in circles, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and onto a road. I nearly cried at the sight of it, this symbol of civilization and safety. I followed it, my pace never slowing, until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy when I burst in, wild-eyed and scratched up. I probably was at that point. I babbled about the symbols, the whispers, the figure in the woods. He listened patiently, then called the police. The officers who responded were kind but skeptical. They took my statement, then drove me out to where I had camped. But when we got there, the clearing was empty. No tent, no fire pit, no symbols carved in the dirt or trees. It was as if I had never been there at all. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, maybe brought on by stress or dehydration. Suggested I see a doctor, get some rest. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I've tried to put it behind me, to rationalize it as a panic attack or some kind of hallucination. But on quiet nights when the wind whistles through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that whisper again. Stay. Sometimes I dream of that figure in the woods in my nightmares. It follows me, always just out of sight, but never far behind. I wake up in a cold sweat. The symbol of the circle and line burned into my mind's eye. I don't go camping anymore, don't even like to be in heavily wooded areas. The rustle of leaves sets my heart racing, and the snap of a twig can send me into a panic. People say the woods are peaceful, a place to connect with nature and find yourself, but I know better now. I know that sometimes the woods are watching, waiting, and if you're not careful they might decide to keep you. That symbol haunts me still. I see it everywhere, in the grain of wood, in the cracks on the sidewalk, in the steam rising from my coffee, a circle with a line through it, so simple yet so terrifying in its implications. What did it mean? Why was it there, and why do I feel deep in my bones that it wasn't a warning but an invitation? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me hopes I never will. But I know one thing for certain: the next time I hear a whisper in the woods, I won't stick around to find out what it's saying. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some invitations better left unanswered, especially when they come from the dark heart of the forest, where ancient things still lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unwary to wander too far from the path. The old man's eyes didn't match his smile. That should have been my first clue. But when you're lost in the woods, cold and hungry, even the strangest shelter can seem like salvation. It wasn't until I was inside the door, locked behind me, that I realized sometimes being lost is safer than being found. I hadn't planned on going off trail. The day had started perfectly crisp autumn, air, leaves crunching underfoot, and a well-marked path through some of the most beautiful forests I'd ever seen. I'm an experienced hiker, not the type to make rookie mistakes. but somewhere between admiring a particularly stunning vista and trying to get the perfect photo for my Instagram. I lost the trail at first. I wasn't worried. I had my phone's GPS, a compass, and enough supplies for a day hike. But as the hours wore on and the sun began to dip behind the mountains, a creeping sense of unease settled in my stomach. My phone's battery was dying and the terrain all looked the same, endless trees and rocky outcroppings that offered no clue as to which direction I should go. Just as panic was starting to set in, I saw a thin trail of smoke rising above the trees in the distance. Where there's smoke there's fire, and where there's fire there are people. I quickened my pace, pushing through the underbrush towards what I hoped was salvation. The cabin appeared suddenly as if it had grown out of the forest itself. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls grey with age. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney and a warm glow spilled from the windows. Relief washed over me. I hurried to the door and knocked, perhaps a bit too eagerly. The door creaked open and there he stood, an old man, probably in his 70s, with a scraggly white beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to look right through me. He smiled, but something about it felt off, like he was practicing an expression he'd seen but didn't quite understand. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice grally but not unkind. "You look a mite lost." I explained my situation, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. The old man, Jack he called himself, listened patiently, nodding along. When I finished, he stepped back from the door. "Can't leave you out here in the cold. Now can I come on in and warm yourself by the fire?" I hesitated for just a moment. Something in the back of my mind whispered a warning, but the promise of warmth and safety overrode any misgivings. I stepped inside. The cabin was cozy if cluttered. Every surface seemed covered with odds and ends, old books, strange-looking tools, jars filled with unidentifiable contents. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jack busied himself in the small kitchen area, putting a kettle on the wood-burning stove, nothing like a hot cup of tea to chase away the chill. He said, his back to me, "Make yourself comfortable." I sank into an old armchair, feeling the day's exertions catching up with me. The warmth of the fire and the sense of safety began to lull me into a state of relaxation. Jack returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to me before settling into a chair opposite. "So," he said, fixing me with those unsettling eyes, "what brings you to these parts?" "Not many folks come up this way anymore." I explained about my hike, how I'd gotten turned around. As I talked, I noticed Jack nodding along, but his eyes kept darting to the windows, as if expecting someone or something to appear. "Yep, these woods can be tricky," he said when I finished. "Been up here for must be 30 years now, seen all sorts come and go." Something about the way he said it made me pause. "Go, you mean other hikers?" Jack's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, all sorts. Hikers, campers, folks, just passing through this forest. It has a way of calling to people, you might say." I sipped my tea, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my gut. "You must get lonely up here all by yourself." His laugh was sudden and sharp like the crack of a whip. "Lonely? No, I'm never alone up here. The forest, she keeps me company, and then there's the visitors, of course." "Like me," I said, attempting a smile. Jack's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw something there that made my blood run cold. "Oh no," he said so softly. "You're special. Been waiting a long time for someone like you." I set my mug down, my hands shaking slightly. "I should probably get going," I said, standing up. "If you could just point me in the direction of the main trail." "Oh, but you can't leave now," Jack said, rising from his chair. "Night's falling and the forest. She gets hungry after dark." I backed away, my heart pounding. "I'll take my chances. Thank you for the tease, but I really need to go." I turned towards the door, but Jack was there before I could blink, far quicker than a man his age should be able to move. He stood between me and the exit, that unnatural smile still plastered on his face. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You see, I made a deal a long time ago. The forest she provides for me keeps me safe, but in return, she needs to be fed, and you, my dear, you're the finest meal she's had in years." I looked around frantically, searching for another way out. The windows were small, too small to climb through. There was a back door, but Jack stood between me and it. My eyes fell on a heavy poker by the fireplace. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I inched towards the fireplace. "What deal? Who are you really?" Jack's smile faded, replaced by a look of almost childlike confusion. "Who am I? I'm Jack. I've always been Jack, haven't I?" For a moment, he looked lost, uncertain, but then his eyes cleared and that terrible smile returned. "It doesn't matter who I am, what matters is that you're here and the forest is waiting." I lunged for the poker, grabbing it and swinging it in front of me like a sword. "Stay back," I shouted. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." Jack didn't seem fazed by the threat. He took a step forward. His movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a strange echoing quality. "You can't leave. No one ever leaves." I swung the poker, catching him on the shoulder. He stumbled back, but there was no cry of pain, no reaction at all. He just kept coming, that terrible smile still fixed on his face. I ran for the back door, fumbling with the lock. I could hear Jack behind me, his breathing ragged and uneven. The door finally gave way and I burst out into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed different. Now the trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The wind whispered through the leaves and I could have sworn I heard my name. I ran blindly, not caring about direction, just needing to put distance between myself and that cabin, between myself and Jack. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I kept going. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. The forest blurred around me and more than once I thought I saw shapes moving in the shadows, always just at the edge of my vision. Finally, my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As I lay there trying to get my bearings, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. I looked up and there was Jack standing just a few feet away. He looked different. Now his skin seemed to ripple and shift, blending with the shadows around him. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "You can't run from the forest," he said. His voice no longer his own. It was deeper, older, filled with the rustle of leaves and the creak of ancient trees. "She's in your blood. Now she's tasted you and she won't let you go." I scrambled to my feet, ready to run again, but I found I couldn't move. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, roots curling around my ankles holding me in place. Jack, or whatever he had become, reached out a hand. "Don't fight it," he said. "Become part of the forest, like I did all those years ago. It's not so bad once you get used to it." As his hand touched my shoulder, I felt a strange sensation like sap flowing through my veins. The forest around me seemed to come alive, every tree, every leaf pulsing with an ancient hungry energy. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but as the forest's will seeped into me, I found I didn't want to anymore. Why had I been so afraid? This was where I belonged. This was home. The last thing I remember is Jack's smile, no longer unnatural but welcoming, a smile I now understood, and as the forest embraced me, I smiled back. Sometimes, when hikers pass through our woods, I see confusion in their eyes. They look at me, this old man in his cabin, and something tells them they should be afraid. But I just smile and invite them in for tea. After all, the forest is always hungry and I made a deal a long time ago. The moment I bit into that potato salad, I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the unexpected taste of meat where there shouldn't have been any. It was the way my neighbors watched me, their eyes gleaming with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I should have trusted my instincts and left right then, but I didn't, and that decision nearly cost me everything. I'd moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago, seeking a quiet place to recharge after a messy divorce. The streets were tree-lined, the houses well-maintained, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough they'd wave as I walked by or offer a quick hello when we crossed paths at the local shops, but there was always something off about their smiles, too wide, too fixed, as if they were wearing masks they couldn't quite control. I'd managed to keep to myself, for the most part politely declining invitations to book clubs and neighborhood watch meetings. But when Sarah, the unofficial ringleader of the block, knocked on my door with an invitation to the annual potluck, I found myself saying yes, before I could think better of it. "Oh, wonderful," she exclaimed, her smile stretching just a bit too far. "We've all been so looking forward to getting to know you better. Don't forget to bring a dish." The day of the potluck arrived, and I found myself standing in Sarah's backyard clutching a bowl of hastily made pasta salad. Long tables groaned under the weight of countless dishes, and the air was filled with the buzz of conversation and the clinking of cutlery. I hovered at the edge of the gathering, feeling out of place. The other neighbors moved around with an easy familiarity, laughing and chatting as they filled their plates. I recognized a few faces: Bob from 2 doors down, the elderly couple from across the street, the young family from the corner house. They all seemed so normal. Maybe I'd been too hasty in my judgment. Maybe this was exactly what I needed to feel more at home in the neighborhood. Deciding to try, I approached the food tables. That's when I noticed something odd. Almost every dish seemed to contain meat, and not just in the ways you'd expect at a barbecue. There was meat in the coal SLA, meat chunks floating in what looked like jello, even what appeared to be a meat-based fruit pie. My vegetarian pasta salad stood out like a sore thumb. "Try the potato salad," a voice said beside me, making me jump. It was Sarah. Her ever-present smile fixed firmly in place. "It's my grandmother's recipe, a real neighborhood favorite." Not wanting to be rude, I spooned a small amount onto my plate. The potato salad looked normal enough, creamy, white with flecks of herbs. But as I took a bite, my taste buds rebelled. Hidden among the potatoes were chunks of something meaty, with a texture I couldn't quite place. I must have made AF face, because Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice honey, sweet, but with an undercurrent. I couldn't quite place. No, I lied, forcing myself to swallow. "It's interesting. I just wasn't expecting meat in the potato salad." Sarah's smile returned wider than ever. "Oh, we put meat and everything around here. It's kind of our thing, you'll get used to it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I looked around, I realized she was right. Every neighbor's plate was piled high with the meat-laden dishes. But something else caught my attention. While they all seemed to be eating enthusiastically, making appreciative noises and going back for seconds, I didn't actually see anyone swallow. A chill ran down my spine. I set my plate down, suddenly not hungry at all. "I think I need some water," I mumbled, heading towards the drinks table. As I walked, I felt eyes on me glancing back. I saw several neighbors watching me intently. Their gazes followed my every move, and their smiles seemed to have taken on a predatory edge. At the drinks table, I poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands. As I raised it to my lips, I caught sight of my reflection in the picture for a moment, just a moment. I thought I saw something else reflected there. Not the faces of my smiling neighbors, but something twisted, inhuman. I dropped the glass water, splashing across my shoes. The conversation around me stuttered to a halt, and I felt every eye in the yard turn towards me. "Is everything all right, dear?" Sarah's voice came from right behind me, making me jump. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and it took every ounce of self-control not to flinch away. Her touch felt wrong. Somehow too cold, too firm. "I'm not feeling well," I managed to stammer out. "I think I should go home." Sarah's grip on my shoulder tightened. "Oh, but you can't leave now. The part's just getting started, and you haven't even tried the main course yet." I turned to face her, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah's smile had grown impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, and her eyes were completely black, like empty voids in her face. I jerked away from her, my heart pounding in my chest. As I looked around wildly, I saw that all my neighbors had undergone a similar transformation. Their faces were distorted, their smiles too wide, their eyes dark and hungry. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What are you people?" Bob, from 2 doors down, stepped forward when he spoke. His voice was a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. We're just your friendly neighborhood welcoming committee, and you, my dear, are the guest of honor." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, pushing past, grasping hands and ignoring the chorus of inhuman voices calling for me to stay. I sprinted across the yard, vaulted over the fence and didn't stop running until I reached my house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and sliding the chain into place. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Through the window, I could see figures moving on the street, my neighbors walking with an unnatural, jerky gait all heading in my direction. I ran upstairs, grabbing my phone to call the police, but when I dialed 911, all I got was a busy signal. I tried again and again, each time met with the same result. A knock at the door made me jump. "Come out." "Dear," Sarah's voice called, sickly sweet. "We just want to welcome you properly to the neighborhood. It won't hurt much." I looked around, frantically searching for a way out the window. I could climb out onto the roof and maybe make it to my car, but as I approached the window, I saw more neighbors in my backyard. Their distorted faces turned up towards me waiting. I was trapped. The knocking at the door grew louder, more insistent. I could hear wood splintering as they began to force their way in. In desperation, I barricaded myself in the bathroom, pushing the heavy vanity in front of the door. I sat on the edge of the tub, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. Any moment now I'd wake up and realize this was all just a terrible nightmare, but the sounds of my neighbors forcing their way into my house were all too real. I could hear them moving through the rooms downstairs, calling out to me and sing-song voices that didn't even try to sound human anymore. As I sat there trembling, my eyes fell on the small window above the toilet. It was tiny, probably too small for me to fit through, but it was my only chance. I had just started to pry it open when the bathroom door shuttered under a heavy impact, wood cracked and I saw fingers, unnaturally long and tipped with sharp claws, curl around the edge of the door. "Here's Johnny," Bob's voice called out, followed by a chorus of inhuman laughter. In a panic, I squeezed myself through the window, scraping my sides raw. In the process, I tumbled onto the roof, rolling dangerously close to the edge before I managed to stop myself below me. The yard was full of my neighbors, all looking up at me with those horrible too-wide smiles, but they seemed unwilling or unable to climb up after me. I shuffled along the roof, making my way to the large oak tree that overhung my driveway. With a silent prayer, I leapt, catching a branch and swinging myself down to land heavily on the hood of my car. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the driver's seat thinking, whatever deity might be listening, that I'd left my keys in the car. The engine roared to life and I peeled out of the driveway, sideswiping Bob. As he lunged at the car in my rearview mirror, I could see my neighbors gathered in the street, watching me drive away. They didn't chase, didn't try to follow. They just stood there, smiling those impossible smiles as if they knew something I didn't. I drove all night, putting as much distance between myself and that neighborhood as I could. I never went back, never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of those smiles of meat where it shouldn't be, of neighbors who aren't quite human, and I wonder how many other neighborhoods out there are just like mine. How many unsuspecting people are sitting down to potlucks, not realizing they're the main course. So if you ever move to a new neighborhood and get invited to a potluck, pay attention to what's on the menu, and if everything seems to have meat in it, even the things that shouldn't, run and don't look back. The moment he asked me if I'd ever been in a plane crash, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary flight, but I had no idea just how dark and twisted our conversation would become or how those hours trapped next to a stranger would change me forever. I'd booked the red-eye flight from New York to Los Angeles on a whim, a last-minute business trip that couldn't wait for a more reasonable hour. The airport was quiet. When I arrived, just a handful of sleepy travelers shuffling through security. I grabbed a coffee, hoping the caffeine would keep me alert enough to get some work done on the flight. Boarding was quick and efficient. The plane was one of those smaller models, just 2 seats on each side of the aisle. I found my window seat in. Settled in, pulling out my laptop and headphones as I was getting situated, a man slid into the seat next to me. He was unremarkable at first glance, mid-30s, maybe early 40s, jeans, hoodie, the kind of outfit you'd expect on a late-night flight. He gave me a quick nod as he sat down, and I returned it with a polite smile before turning my attention back to my computer. The plane took off without incident, and I tried to focus on my work, but after about 30 minutes I felt a tap on my arm. I pulled out an earbud and turned to my seatmate. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice friendly enough. I hesitated. I'm not usually one for small talk on flights, especially not at this hour, but something in his expression made me feel like it would be rude to ignore him. "Los Angeles," I replied. "Business trip," he nodded, seeming genuinely interested. "Do you? You fly often sometimes," I said, hoping my short answers would discourage further conversation. He leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on mine. "You ever been in a crash?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't the usual airplane small talk. I felt a slight chill run down my spine. "No," I said flatly. Turning back to my laptop, he chuckled a low sound that made me uncomfortable. "You ever wonder what it would feel like?" I stared at him, unsure how to respond. His eyes were bright, almost fevered, and his smile didn't quite reach them. "Not really," I managed to say, my mouth suddenly dry. He leaned back in his seat, but his eyes never left my face. "I think about it sometimes. You know how fast it would all happen if you'd even feel it." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, looking around for a flight attendant, but the cabin was dark, most passengers asleep or absorbed in their own worlds. "I'm sure it's not something we need to worry about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Flying is statistically very safe." He laughed again. That same unsettling chuckle. "Statistics don't mean much when you're plummeting from 30,000 feet, do they?" I didn't respond, instead putting my earbud back in and staring intently at my screen, but I couldn't focus on the words in front of me. My heart was racing and I could feel his eyes on me. After a few minutes, I felt another tap on my arm. Against my better judgment, I turned to look at him. "You ever think about what people are really like?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "What do you mean?" I asked. Despite myself. He leaned in closer and I could smell his breath, a mix of coffee and something metallic. "You know what they're hiding, their secrets, the dark stuff." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly bone dry. I don't really think about that kind of thing." His eyes gleamed in the dim cabin light. "Everyone's got something, a secret, something dark. They don't want the world to know." I shifted away from him as much as my seat would allow. "Look, I really need to get some work done." "What's yours?" he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have any dark secrets," I said, trying to sound firm, but hearing the tremor in my voice, he smiled. A slow, creeping thing that made my skin crawl. "Everyone does. Maybe you just don't know yours yet." I pressed the call button, praying for a flight attendant to appear, but no one came. No, he continued, seemingly oblivious to my discomfort in a crash. "All those secrets would come out in those last moments when you know it's all over." "What would you confess?" I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking my laptop to the floor. "I need to use the restroom," I mumbled, not meeting his eyes. As I squeezed past him, I felt his hand rush against my leg. It could have been an accident. The space was tight after all, but something about the touch felt deliberate, invasive. In the tiny airplane bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm my racing heart. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, seeing the fear in my own eyes. This was ridiculous. He was just a weird guy making inappropriate conversation, nothing to be afraid of. But as I opened the door to return to my seat, I saw him watching me. His eyes followed my every move as I walked down the aisle, and that smile, that terrible, knowing smile, was still plastered on his face. I sat down immediately, putting my earbuds in and turning up the volume on my music. I didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, but I could feel his presence next to me, oppressive and unsettling. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I felt another tap on my arm. I ignored it. He tapped again, harder. This time I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. Then I felt his breath on my ear as he leaned in close. "You can't ignore me forever," he whispered. "We're stuck here together. You and me might as well make the most of it." I jerked away, finally turning to face him. Please. I said, my voice shaking. I don't want to talk, I just want to be left alone. His smile widened, but we were having such an interesting conversation. Don't you want to know what my dark secret is? I shook my head, feeling panic rising in my chest. No, I really don't. He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. What if I told you I've been in a crash before? What if I told you I was the only survivor? My blood ran cold. I looked into his eyes, searching for something, some sign that he was joking, that this was all some sick game. But all I saw was a deep, unsettling darkness. That's not funny. I managed to say. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat. It wasn't meant to be truth. Rarely is. I stood up again, this time determined to find a flight attendant to beg for a seat change if necessary. But as I turned to the aisle, the plane lurched violently. The seat bell sign dinged on and a voice came over the intercom asking all passengers to return to their seats immediately. I fell back into my seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the seat belt. The plane shuttered again and I heard the distinct sound of the engines changing pitch next to me. The man started to laugh. It was a wild, unhinged sound that sent shivers down my spine. Here we go, he said, his eyes wide, with something that looked disturbingly like excitement. Time to face those secrets, time to see what we're really made of. The plane dropped suddenly and screams erupted throughout the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling and the scene devolved into chaos. As I reached for my mask with trembling hands, I felt his grip on my arm. I turned to look at him one last time, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. His face was transformed, alight with a manic glee that was terrifying to behold. Tell me. He shouted over the roar of the failing engines and the screams of the other passengers. What's your darkest secret? What will you take to your grave? In that moment, as the plane plummeted and my life flashed before my eyes, I realized something. I did have a secret, a darkness I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed, and as I looked into the crazed eyes of the stranger next to me, I felt that darkness arise to the surface. I began, but my words were cut off by another violent lurch of the plane. The last thing I remember is his laughter rising above the chaos as the world around us disintegrated into fire and twisted metal. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, one of only a handful of survivors. They told me I was lucky, that it was a miracle. I'd made it out alive. But as I lay there replaying those final moments in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that luck had nothing to do with it. The man next to me hadn't survived. They never found his body. Sometimes I wonder if he was ever really there at all, or if he was some sort of manifestation of my own buried darkness. But in my darkest moments, when I close my eyes and hear the screech of tearing metal, I can still see his face, still hear his laugh, and I wonder what was his secret. And, more importantly, what was mine? The moment I saw him standing in my kitchen stirring a cup of coffee he'd made in my own mug, I knew my life would never be the same. There's a special kind of terror that comes from finding a stranger in your home, a violation so profound it shakes you to your very core. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that was about to unfold. It had been a long day at work, one of those soul-crushing shifts where everything that could go wrong did. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, all I wanted was a hot shower, a glass of wine, and the mind-numbing comfort of reality TV. I trudged up the stairs, fumbling with my keys, my mind already on the leftover pizza waiting in my fridge. I should have noticed something was off the moment I opened the door. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that felt wrong somehow, but I was too tired, too caught up in my own thoughts, to pay attention to that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I tossed my keys on the little table by the door, kicked off my shoes and headed towards the kitchen. That's when I saw him. He was standing at my counter, his back to me, stirring a mug of what smelled like coffee for a split second. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Maybe I'd walked into the wrong apartment. But no, there was the tacky fruit bowl. My mom had given me the magnets on the fridge, spelling out sarcastic messages before I could react, before I could run or scream or do any of the things you're supposed to do when you find an intruder in your home. He turned around. "Hey there," he said, his voice calm and friendly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "You're home early." I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He was older than me, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of face you'd expect to see on a kindly uncle, but his eyes. There was something off about his eyes. They didn't match the easy smile on his face. Who are you? I managed to stammer out, my hands still on the doorknob, ready to bolt. He chuckled, taking a sip from the mug. My mug, I realized with a jolt. I could ask you the same thing, he said, but I won't, I already know. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? You know this is my apartment. You shouldn't be here. He set the mug down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Is it, though? Are you sure about that? I felt like I was in some kind of twisted dream. Nothing made sense, of course, I'm sure. I said, my voice rising. I've lived here for 3 years. You need to leave now. His smile never wavered, but something changed in his eyes, a hardness, a glint of something dangerous. 3 years, that's cute. My hand was shaking on the doorknob. I needed to run to get out of there and call the police, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know who you are or how you got in here, but you need to go. I'm calling the police. I reached for my phone, but he was faster. In 2 quick strides, he crossed the kitchen and was standing in front of me. I hadn't realized how tall he was until that moment, how he seemed to loom over me. You're not calling anyone, he said, his voice low and menacing. We're going to have a little chat, you and me, about who really belongs here. I backed away, my heart racing. Please, I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. Just take whatever you want and go. I won't call the cops, I swear. He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Oh, sweetheart. I'm not here to rob you. I'm here to reclaim what's mine. I turned to run, but he caught my arm in a grip, like iron. Not so fast, he growled. We're not done here. I struggled against his hold. Panic, rising in my chest, let go of me. I shouted, hoping against hope that one of my neighbors would hear, but his next words froze me in place. No one can hear you, he said, his voice eerily calm. No one's going to come, save you, because you're not really here, are you? I stared at him, confusion mixing with fear. What are you talking about? He pulled me closer. His face inches from mine. I could smell coffee on his breath, mixed with something metallic. This apartment, this life you think you've been living for 3 years, it's not real. None of it is real. I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. You're crazy, I said. Of course this is real. I have memories I have implanted. He cut me off. All of it. Memories, feelings, this whole identity you've created. But it's time to wake up now, time to remember who you really are. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The room seemed to shift and waver like I was looking at it through water. No, I whispered. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. He released my arm, but I no longer felt the urge to run. My legs were shaking so badly I wasn't sure they could support me. Sit down, he said, gesturing to one of the kitchen chairs. Let me explain. Against my better judgment, I sank into the chair. He sat across from me, those unsettling eyes never leaving my face. You're not who you think you are, he began. Your real name is Sarah Jennings. You're a deep cover operative for a government agency, so secret most people in power don't even know it exists. 3 years ago, you were sent on a mission. Something went wrong. You were captured. Your mind was altered. This, he gestured around the apartment. This is all a construct, a prison built in your own mind. I shook my head, feeling tears start to well up in my eyes. No, that's impossible. I have a job, I have friends, I have a life here. He leaned forward, his voice softening. Think about it, really think. Can you remember your childhood? Your parents' faces, the name of your first pet? Or are those memories fuzzy, indistinct? I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him, of course I remembered those things, but as I searched my mind, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't. My past was a blur, a series of vague impressions rather than clear memories. This can't be real. I whispered more to myself than to him. But it is, he said, and now it's time to leave. We finally found you, finally figured out how to break through the mental blocks, but we don't have much time. As if on cue, I heard a sound like distant thunder. The walls of the apartment seemed to vibrate, books falling from shelves, pictures rattling on the walls. What's happening? I asked, panic rising in my voice. He stood up, holding out his hand to me, and the construct is collapsing. Your captors know we're here. Here, we need to go now. I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind reeling. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all some elaborate hoax, that any moment I'd wake up, and this would all be a bad dream. But deep down, in a place I hadn't even known, existed something stirred, a recognition, a sense of truth in his words. How do we get out? I heard myself asking, even as another part of me screamed, that this was insanity. You have to let go, he said. Let go of this false life, these false memories. Remember who you really are. The rumbling grew, louder, cracks began to appear in the walls, spreading like spiderwebs across the ceiling. I could feel the floor shifting beneath my feet. I closed my eyes, trying to focus. Who was I? What was real? Images flashed through my mind, training sessions, covert meetings, a life I didn't recognize but somehow knew was mine. When I opened my eyes, the apartment was disintegrating around us through the cracks. I could see not the hallway or the apartment next door, but a swirling void of color and light. Sarah, the man said, his voice urgent. It's time, take my hand. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and suddenly I knew him not as a stranger, not as an intruder, but as someone I trusted with my life. I reached out and took his hand. The world exploded around us in a cacophony of sound and light. I felt like I was falling, drowning, being torn apart and put back together all at once, and then I woke up. I was lying on a cold metal table, wires and tubes connected to my body. The room around me was stark and clinical, filled with beef machines and concerned faces. Welcome back, Agent Jennings, a voice said. I turned to see the man from the apartment, my handler, I now remembered, standing beside me. You've been gone a long time. We've got a lot of work to do. As the memories of my real life came flooding back, I felt a pang of loss for the simple, ordinary existence I'd left behind. But I also felt a surge of purpose, of rightness. This was who I was meant to be. I sat up, wincing at muscles, stiff from disuse. All right, I said, my voice hoarse, but determined. Let's get to work. The life I'd known was gone, shattered like the illusion it had always been, but a new life. My real life was just beginning, and this time I was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. 1 second she was there, her yellow jacket, a bright spot in the sea of green and brown. The next she was gone, vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in my head, searching for something. I might have missed some clue that could explain how my 5-year-old daughter could disappear in broad daylight. But all I'm left with is the gut-wrenching knowledge that I looked away for just a moment, and in that moment everything changed. It was supposed to be a normal day at the park. Lily and I had been coming here since she was a baby. It was our special place, a sprawling, green oasis in the heart of the city, with winding paths, a duck pond and a playground that Lily adored. We knew every inch of this park, or so I thought the day had started. Like any other, Lily was excited, chattering away about feeding the ducks and going on the swings. I packed a small bag with snacks, her favorite stuffed rabbit and some bread for the ducks. As we walked to the park, Lily skipped ahead, her yellow jacket, a birthday gift from her grandmother, making her easy to spot, even when she got a little too far ahead. We arrived at the park just after lunch. It was a beautiful day, warm for early autumn, and the park was bustling with people, families picnicking on the grass, joggers on the paths, older folks feeding the ducks. Lily immediately wanted to go to the playground, so we made our way there. Her small hand clasped in mine. At the playground, Lily ran from one piece of equipment to another, her energy seemingly boundless. I sat on a nearby bench, keeping a watchful eye on her as she played. Other parents were doing the same, and there was a general atmosphere of relaxed enjoyment. After about an hour, Lily came running up to me, her cheeks flushed with exertion. "Mommy, can we feed the ducks now?" she asked, her eyes wide, with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, Standing up and gathering our things, let's go. We walked hand in hand to the pond, Lily skipping every few steps. When we reached the water's edge, a group of ducks swam over, clearly used to being fed by visitors. Lily giggled as they quacked and jostled for position. I pulled out the bag of bread and handed Lily a piece. Remember, I said small pieces, so they don't choke. Lily nodded solemnly, tearing the bread into tiny bits and tossing them to the eager ducks. Her laughter echoed across the water as the ducks dove for the bread, creating ripples that spread out in concentric circles. We stood there for a while, Lily, entranced by the duck, and me, content to watch her. Joy, it was a perfect moment, one of those times when you wish you could freeze, frame your life and stay there forever. But life doesn't work that way. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing a text from my boss about an urgent work matter. I sighed knowing I needed to respond, but not wanting to take my attention away from Lily. Sweetheart, I said, Mommy needs to answer this message. Real quick, stay right here where I can see you. Okay, Lily nodded. Her attention still focused on the ducks. I stepped back a few paces, my eyes still on her, as I began to type out a response. It was a complex issue requiring more of my attention than I had anticipated. I found myself rereading the message, formulating a careful reply. It couldn't have been more than a minute, maybe 2 at most, but when I looked up from my phone, Lily was gone. At first I wasn't worried. Lily had a habit of wandering a few steps away, distracted by a butterfly or an interesting leaf. I scanned the immediate area, expecting to see her yellow jacket bobbing along the water's edge. Nothing, Lily. I called out, my voice calm but with an edge of concern. No response. I walked along the shore, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for that familiar splash of yellow. My heart began to beat faster as I realized she wasn't anywhere near the pond. Lily, I called again, louder. This time a few nearby people looked up, registering the panic. In my voice, I spun around, my eyes, frantically searching every direction. The playground was empty. The picnic area was full of strangers. No sign of Lily anywhere. The panic that had been building in my chest exploded. Lily! I screamed, my voice echoing across the park. People stopped what they were doing, turning to look at the crazy woman yelling at the top of her lungs. I ran back to the playground, hoping against hope that she had returned there. Empty swings creaked in the breeze, mocking me with their emptiness. I checked under the slide behind the bushes. Anywhere a small child might hide, nothing. By now, other people in the park had realized something was wrong. A young couple approached me. Concern etched on their faces. Are you okay? The woman asked. What's wrong? My daughter, I gasped, struggling to breathe through the panic. She's missing. She was just here and now she's gone. She's 5 years old, wearing a yellow jacket. Please, have you seen her? They shook their heads but immediately offered to help search. Within minutes, a small army of strangers had mobilized, spreading out across the park, calling Lily's name. I don't know who called the police, but suddenly they were there asking me questions I could barely focus on. What was she wearing? When did I last see her? Did she know anyone in the park? I answered as best I could, my mind replaying those last moments over and over, her laughter as she fed the ducks, the way the sunlight glinted off her hair, the yellow of her jacket, bright against the green of the grass. Hours passed in a blur. The police searched every inch of the park. Divers were called in to check the pond, a possibility I couldn't bear to consider. As night fell, they brought in dogs to try and pick up her scent. Nothing. It was as if Lily had simply ceased to exist. One moment there, the next gone, leaving no trace behind. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The police investigation continued, but leads were scarce. Lily's face was plastered on posters all over the city, broadcast on every news channel. I appeared on TV pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The theories were endless. She was abducted, she wandered off and got lost. She fell into the pond and the divers somehow missed her. Each possibility was more horrifying than the last. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My whole life became consumed with finding little. I quit my job, spent every waking moment retracing our steps that day, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. But as time passed, hope began to fade. The police visits became less frequent, the news reports moved on to other stories, people stopped recognizing me on the street, stopped offering their condolences or theories. Life, it seemed, was moving on, but I was stuck frozen in that moment by the PP on eternally turning away from my daughter for the last time. 1 year after Lily's disappearance, I returned to the park. I don't know what I expected to find. Some clue, overlooked, some evidence that had been missed, or maybe I just needed to be in the place where I last saw her to feel close to her again. I stood by the pond watching the ducks swim lazily across the surface. A little girl in a red coat ran past her mother calling after her to be careful. I felt a pang in my chest, a pain so acute it took my breath away as I turned to leave. Something caught my eye there, half hidden in the reeds. At the water's edge was a flash of yellow. My heart stopped with trembling hands. I reached out and pulled it free. It was a piece of fabric, weathered and faded, but unmistakably the same shade as Lily's jacket. How had this been missed? How had I missed it? In all my searches, I clutched the fabric to my chest, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't Lily, but it was something, a tangible piece of evidence that she had been here that I hadn't imagined at all. As I stood there holding that small piece of yellow fabric, I made a promise to Lily, to myself, to whatever power might be listening, I would never stop looking, never stop hoping somewhere out there. My daughter was waiting to be found, and I would search until my last breath to bring her home. The park continued its life around me. Children laughed, ducks quacked, joggers ran past, but for me, time stood still in my mind. Lily was still 5 years old, still wearing her yellow jacket and still just out of reach, and I would keep reaching, keep searching until I found her again. Have you ever felt the weight of 1,000 eyes boring into the back of your skull? I have, for miles upon miles of empty highway, with nothing but darkness ahead and a pair of headlights behind. I felt it. Those lights weren't just following me. They were hunting me. And as the night wore on, I began to realize that this wasn't just a case of paranoia. This was something far more sinister. It had been a long day. I'd spent hours at a client meeting 2 states over, and now I was making the long drive back home. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of my car engine and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. I was tired, but the coffee from my last rest stop was doing its job, keeping me alert enough to navigate the empty stretches of highway. I'd been driving for about 3 hours. When I first noticed the car behind me at first, I didn't think much of it. It's not unusual to have company on a long drive, even at this hour, but as the miles ticked by, I realized that this car had been with me for an unusually long time. I checked my rear view mirror again. The headlights were there steady and unchanging, not too close, but not falling behind either. Just there. Always there. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably nothing. Maybe they were heading to the same city I was. Maybe they were just as tired as I was and were using my taillights as a guide through the darkness. But then I noticed something odd. I was going exactly the speed limit. Not wanting to risk a ticket this far from home. The car behind me matched my speed perfectly. When I sped up slightly to pass a slow-moving truck, they sped up too. When I slowed back down, so did they. My heart rate picked up a notch. This wasn't normal. No one drives like that. Maintaining the exact same distance for this long. I decided to test my theory. I slowed down significantly, dropping well below the speed limit. The car behind me slowed too, maintaining that same maddeningly consistent gap. Okay, I thought, trying to keep my breathing steady. Maybe they're just really cautious drivers. I'll speed up and they'll probably fall behind. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my speed well above the limit. The scenery blurred as I raced down the empty highway. For a moment I felt a surge of relief as the headlights in my mirror seemed to shrink, but it was short-lived within seconds. The car had accelerated too, closing the distance between us with unnerving precision. Once again they settled into that same position. Not too close, not too far. Just watching by now, my palms were sweating on the steering wheel. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't normal driving behavior. Someone was following me deliberately and with purpose. I tried to get a look at the driver, tilting my rearview mirror and squinting into the darkness, but all I could see were those headlights, two bright orbs piercing the night. The windshield of the car behind me was a black void, revealing nothing about its occupants. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it a cop? But no, there were no flashing lights, no attempt to pull me over, a robber looking for an isolated victim. But why follow for so long? Why not make a move? I checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course not out here in the middle of nowhere. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through the darkness. No exits in sight, no towns, not even another car, just me and my silent pursuer. I considered pulling over, but the thought of stopping out here alone with whoever was in that car made my blood run cold. No, I had to keep driving, had to find somewhere safe, somewhere with people. Hours seemed to pass, though my clock told me it had only been minutes. Every curve in the road, every hill I hoped, would bring me to a town, a gas station, anything. But there was only more highway, more darkness, and always those headlights behind me. I began to talk to myself, trying to stay calm, trying to reason it out. It's okay, you're okay, they haven't done anything. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe my words were cut short as I crested a hill and saw something that made my heart leap. Headlights ahead, another car coming towards me in the opposite lane. For a moment I felt a surge of relief. I wasn't alone out here after all. But as the car approached, an idea struck me, a crazy, dangerous idea. But in my panicked state it seemed like my only option. As the oncoming car drew near, I took a deep breath, gripped the steering wheel tight and did something I'd never done before. I flashed my headlights over and over the universal signal for help on the road. The oncoming car slowed and I saw its brake lights come on. My pursuer, caught off guard by this unexpected move, fell back slightly. I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The other car pulled over too. A little ahead of me, an older man stepped out. Confusion and concern on his face. "Face, are you all right?" He called out, walking towards my car. I was about to respond, to pour out my story of the car that had been following me. When I glanced in my rear-view mirror, the headlights were gone. I blinked. Sure, I must be mistaken. But no, the road behind me was empty, dark and silent, as if no one had ever been there. "Miss," the man said. Now, standing by my window, "Is everything okay? Do you need help?" I turned to him, my mind reeling. There was a car following me for hours. It was right behind me, I swear. He looked past me down the empty road. "I don't see anyone." Are you sure you weren't just tired? Sometimes the mind can play tricks when you've been driving too long. I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't imagining things, but as I sat there, the adrenaline fading from my system, doubt began to creep in. Had I imagined at all? Was it just fatigue and coffee and the monotony of the long drive playing tricks on me? "Maybe you're right," I said, trying to force a smile. "I've been on the road for a long time. Guess I'm more tired than I thought." The man nodded sympathetically. "Why don't you follow me to the next town? It's not far and there's a motel where you can rest for the night. It's not safe to drive when you're this exhausted." I agreed, grateful for his kindness and for the prospect of not being alone on this dark highway anymore. As we pulled back onto the road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights reappear, but the road behind me remained empty. We reached the small town about 20 minutes later and, true to his word, the man directed me to a small motel just off the highway. He waited until I had checked in before waving goodbye and continuing on his journey in my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body trembling with leftover adrenaline and exhaustion. I kept replaying the night in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really imagined it all? Was it just a product of an overactive imagination in too many late-night crime shows? But as I was about to turn off the light and try to get some sleep, my phone buzzed. Signal had returned and with it a flood of notifications, missed calls, text messages, emails. I scrolled through them absently until one text caught my eye and made my blood run cold. It was from an unknown number sent just minutes ago. "You got lucky tonight. Sleep tight, see you on the road." I stared at the message, my hands shaking so badly. I nearly dropped the phone. It hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been following me, someone had been hunting me on that dark, lonely highway, and somehow they had my number. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in that motel room, jumping at every sound, peering out the window at every passing car. When dawn finally broke, I checked out and hit the road again, this time sticking to busy highways and driving straight through to home. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Every time I get behind the wheel, every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror, I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine, because I know now that the darkness doesn't just hide monsters in closets or under beds. Sometimes the real monsters are out there on the open road, hidden behind a pair of headlights, just waiting for their chance to strike. Exhaustion can play tricks on your mind, but it can't unlock a door you know you've locked. It can't leave muddy footprints on a carpet you've never stepped on, and it certainly can't explain the feeling of eyes watching you in an empty room. That night at the motel, I learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide under your bed, but the ones that have the key to your room. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless stretch of highway and my back aching from too many hours hunched over the steering wheel. The neon sign of the Sleepy Pine Motel glowed like a beacon in the darkness, promising a bed and a few hours of desperately needed rest. Before I had to hit the road again, the night clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I checked in, sliding a key across the worn counter with a mumbled room 104. I nodded my thanks, too tired for conversation, and made my way across the parking lot. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a budget motel. In the middle of nowhere, faded wallpaper, a lumpy bed and the faint smell of old cigarette smoke that no amount of air freshener could quite mask. But at that moment it looked like the Ritz-Carlton to my weary eyes. I did a quick sweep of the room out of habit, checking the locks on the door and window, peeking behind the shower curtain. Satisfied that everything was secure, I tossed my bag onto the chair in the corner and collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to take off my shoes. I must have fallen asleep instantly, because the next thing I knew I was jolting awake, my heart pounding. Something had woken me, but in the fuzzy space between sleep and waking, I couldn't remember what. The room was dark, the only light coming from the neon sign outside casting an eerie red glow through the thin curtains. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it a soft click, like someone trying to turn a doorknob. Very, very slowly. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, convinced I must have imagined it, but there it was again, slightly louder. This time I sat up, my eyes fixed on the door. The handle jiggled once, twice, then silence. Hello. I called out my voice, sounding small and scared stared in the quiet room. No response. I slid out of bed, my feet hitting the carpet with a soft thud. That's when I felt it, dampness seeping through my socks. Confused, I reached for the bedside lamp, flicking it on. My heart nearly stopped there. Leading from the door to the bed was a trail of muddy footprints, footprints that weren't mine. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming. I had to be dreaming, but the chill of the damp carpet against my feet felt all too real. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand ready to call for help, but as I unlocked the screen I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was 3:07 a.m. I had been asleep for over 4 hours, for hours during which someone had been in my room. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't safe here. I needed to leave now. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to check if I had everything. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. What if they were still out there waiting? But staying in this room felt like being trapped in a cage. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open, ready to make a run for it. The parking lot was empty, eerily quiet under the flickering neon light. My car sat where I had left it, a comforting sight in the sea of uncertainty. I sprinted across the parking lot, fumbling with my keys. Just as I reached my car, I heard its footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from the direction of my room. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot with a screech of TIR. As I sped down the dark highway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road watching my car disappear into the night. But when I looked again, the road behind me was empty. I drove for hours too scared to stop jumping at every shadow and sound. When the sun finally rose, I pulled into a busy truck stop, the normality of morning commuters and tired truckers. A balm to my frayed nerves. As I sat there nursing a cup of terrible coffee, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it just an especially vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But then I looked down and saw the mud still caked on my socks. This was no dream. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A locked room, mysterious footprints, a vanishing intruder. It sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie, but I know what I saw, what I felt. Now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of that night. I avoid motels whenever possible, preferring to sleep in my car at rest stops if I have to, and every night, just before I fall asleep, I check the locks twice, because I know now that sometimes locks aren't enough to keep the monsters out. But the thing that haunts me most, the question that keeps me up at night, is this: what if the footprints hadn't woken me up? What was the intruder planning to do? And, most chillingly of all, how many other people have slept in that room blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows? I'll never know the answers to these questions, but one thing's for certain: I'll never forget the night. I learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, but what you can't, the presence you feel but can't explain. The eyes you know are watching even when the room is empty. So the next time you're in a motel room and you hear that soft click in the middle of the night, remember my story, check the locks, and maybe, just maybe, sleep with one eye open, because you never know who might have the key to your room. As for me, I've learned to live with the paranoia, the constant looking over my shoulder. It's a small price to pay for survival, because I know that somewhere out there in some nameless town, off some forgotten highway, there's a motel room with muddy footprints that lead to an empty bed, and someone or something is still waiting for its next unsuspecting guest. I often wonder about that night clerk, about whether he knew what was happening in room 104. Was he in on it, or was he just another cog in a machine he didn't understand? I've thought about going back, about confronting him, demanding answers, but then I remember the sound of those footsteps chasing me across the parking lot, and I know I can never go back there. Sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, and still I find myself replaying every detail of that night in my mind. The click of the door handle, the damp carpet under my feet, the figure in the rearview mirror. And I wonder, what if I hadn't woken up? What if I had slept through the night oblivious to the intruder in my room? Would I have ever known they were there? Or would I have become just another missing person, another unsolved mystery? These thoughts used to keep me up at night, but now I've learned to use them as a reminder to stay vigilant, to trust my instincts, and to never, ever take my safety for granted. Because I know now that the world is full of dark corners and hidden dangers, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and the unthinkable is a flimsy lock and your own awareness. So if you ever find yourself in a motel room feeling that inexplicable sense of unease, don't ignore it, don't brush it off as paranoia or an overactive imagination, because sometimes, just sometimes, those feelings are trying to tell you something, and in my experience, it's always better to be safe than sorry. After all, you never know who might have the key to your room. You never truly know a person until you're trapped in a car with them for hours on end. I learned this lesson the hard way on a stretch of lonely highway, with a stranger whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. What started as an act of kindness quickly spiraled into the most terrifying ride of my life. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I saw him thumb out, standing on the side of the road. It was getting dark and the clouds overhead threatened rain. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about his dejected posture and the desolate surroundings made me slow down. As I pulled over, I got a better look at him. He seemed normal enough, mid-30s, maybe, wearing jeans and a jacket that had seen better days. His hair was a bit messy and there was dirt on his shoes. Like he'd been walking for a while, he jogged up to the car, a grateful smile on his face. "Thanks man," he said. As he climbed in, "Not a lot of people stop anymore." I nodded, trying to play it. "Cool, where are you headed?" "Just down the road a bit," he replied. "Settling into the passenger seat anywhere you're going is good enough for me." I pulled back onto the road. The silence in the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional swish of the wipers, clearing the light drizzle that had started to fall. Been out here long? I asked, just to break the silence. A couple hours, I guess. He said, his voice flat. Had a ride earlier, but they were going in the wrong direction. I nodded, not really sure what to say to that. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness outside growing deeper as we left the last vestiges of twilight behind. So he said after a while, turning to face me, "You pick up hitchhikers often?" "Not really," I admitted. "First time actually," he chuckled. A low sound that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. "First time. Must be my lucky night." I forced a smile but didn't say anything. Something about the way he said it rubbed me the wrong way. "You ever meet someone and just know they've done bad things?" he asked. Suddenly I glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, still staring straight ahead. "You know, some people. You can just tell they've done things, hurt people, maybe even killed people." My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I guess I don't really think about it." He chuckled again. That same low sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Yeah, most people don't, but I can always tell." I didn't respond, didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. We were miles from anywhere. No other cars on the road, no cell signal. "You ever do something you regret?" he asked, his voice quieter. Now I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "Never," he pressed. "Never hurt someone, never thought about it." "No," I managed to say, my throat dry. He was silent for a moment and I could feel his eyes on me. "I have," he said. Finally my stomach dropped. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "Couple years ago," he continued, his voice casual, as if he was discussing the weather. "Met this guy at a bar. He was mouthing off, saying things he shouldn't have. I didn't mean to hurt him. Not really, just wanted to shut him up, but things got out of hand. I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke." What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "He didn't make it. Cops never found out. It's not hard to hide something like that if you know what you're doing." I couldn't breathe. My palm was sweating on the steering wheel. I needed to get out of this car, needed to get away from this man. "You ever wonder what it's like?" he asked. Leaning closer to take someone's life, I shook my head violently. "No, never." He smiled, and it was the coldest, most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "It's not like they show in the movies. It's messier, louder, but once you do it you get used to it. It gets easier." I was trembling now, unable to hide my fear. I needed to do something, to say something, but my mind was blank. With terror, "Pull over," he said suddenly. "What pull over?" he repeated, his voice harder. "Now I need to stretch my legs." I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. If I stopped, would he try to hurt me? But if I didn't, what would he do? I said, "Pull over." He growled and I felt something press against my side. I didn't need to look to know it was a knife. I eased the car onto the shoulder, my heart pounding so hard. I thought it might burst out of my chest. As soon as we stopped, he grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "Get out," he ordered. I didn't move, couldn't move. This was it. This was how I was going to die, on the side of some deserted highway, at the hands of a murderer. I'd willingly led into my car. I said, "Get out." He shouted, yanking me towards the door. In that moment survival instinct kicked in. I threw the car into drive and flew it. The sudden movement caught him off guard and his grip on my arm loosened. I jerked the wheel hard, sending him crashing into the passenger door. He roared in anger, lunging at me with the knife KN. I ducked, feeling the blade whistle past my ear. The car swerved wildly as I struggled to keep control while fending him off. I don't know how long we fought like that, the car kenning down the highway, his knife flashing in the darkness. At some point I saw headlights in the distance. Hope surged through me. If I could just make it to that other car. With one hand on the wheel, I used the other to grab his wrist, trying to keep the knife away from me. We struggled through the car, weaving back and forth across the road. The headlights grew closer. I could see now that it was a large truck. I steered towards it, praying the driver would see us, would stop to help. At the last second, my attacker saw what I was doing. With a snarl of rage, he jerked the wheel, sending us spinning off the road. The world tilted and whirled, the sound of crunching metal and breaking glass filling my ears. When the motion finally stopped, I was hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Everything hurt. I could taste blood in my mouth through the shattered windshield. I could see the truck had stopped its headlights, illuminating the wreck of my car. I turned my head, wincing at the pain, to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. The door was open, swinging gently in the night breeze. He was gone. I heard voices, footsteps, running towards the car, the truck driver coming to help. I wanted to warn him, to tell him to be careful, that there was a dangerous man out there. But darkness was creeping in at the edges of my vision, and I couldn't find the strength to speak as I slipped into unconsciousness. My last thought was of the hitchhiker. Where was he? Had he survived the crash? And if he had, who would be his next victim? I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. The police had questions, of course, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker, no evidence that he had ever existed, except for the cuts and bruises on my body and the terror that still gripped me every time I closed my eyes. They found the knife, though, wedged under the passenger seat, right where he had been sitting, proof that I hadn't imagined at all. I don't drive at night anymore, don't pick up hitchhikers, obviously, but sometimes when I'm on a long stretch of highway and I see a lone figure on the side of the road, I can't help but wonder. Is it him? Is he still out there thumbing rides and telling his terrible stories? And I wonder about the people who stop for him. Do they make it to their destinations, or do they become another story, another confession whispered in the dark of a stranger's car? I'll never know. But I do know one thing: sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're sitting right next to you, smiling and telling you exactly who they are, and by the time you realize the danger, it's already too late. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see someone on the side of the road, think twice before you stop, because you never know who might be getting into your car, and you never know if you'll make it to your destination. I never thought I'd be afraid of my own shadow, but that's what happens when you realize your every move is being watched. What started as a budget-friendly getaway turned into a nightmare of surveillance and paranoia, all thanks to a host who couldn't seem to let go. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My girlfriend Claire and I had been planning it for weeks, a chance to escape the city, breathe some fresh air and reconnect away from the pressures of work and daily life. When we found the Airbnb listing for a charming suburban house at a price that seemed too good to be true, we jumped on it without a second thought. The drive out was pleasant enough. We left the towering skyscrapers behind, watching as the landscape gradually shifted to neatly manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. The neighborhood where our Airbnb was located looked like something out of a 1950s sitcom, all identical houses with white picket fences and perfectly trimmed hedges. We pulled up to the address, a quaint 2-story house with blue shutters and a red door. As we were getting our bags out of the car, the front door opened and our host stepped out. Roger was a man in his early 50s, with thinning hair and a smile that seemed a bit too wide. He greeted us enthusiastically, helping with our bags and ushering us inside. "Welcome, welcome," he said, his voice dripping with an almost manic cheerfulness. "I'm so excited to have you here. It's been too long since I've had guests." The inside of the house was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed, every cushion was perfectly plumped, and there wasn't a speck of dust to be seen. It felt less like a lived-in home and more like a showroom. Roger gave us a tour, pointing out every feature with pride. "And here's the kitchen, fully stocked, of course. Feel free to use anything you like. Oh, and the backyard. You must see the backyard." As we followed him from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to linger a bit too long on CLA, or how he kept finding excuses to touch things we had brought, straightening a jacket here, adjusting a bag there. Finally, after what felt like hours, Roger headed for the door. "Well, I'll leave you two to get settled. I'm right next door if you need anything at all." As the door closed behind him, Claire and I exchanged looks. Is it just me, she said, or was that a little intense? I nodded, relieved. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Yeah, he's certainly enthusiastic about hosting. We tried to shake off the weird vibe and enjoy our evening. We cooked dinner, opened a bottle of wine and tried to relax, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It started with little things. A creak in the hallway when we were both in the living room, a shadow passing by the window that didn't quite match up with the trees outside. At one point I could have sworn I heard breathing on the other side of the bedroom door. You're just being paranoid. I told myself, old houses make noise. It's probably nothing. But then, as we were getting ready for bed, Claire's face suddenly went pale. Tom, she whispered, pointing at the ceiling. Is that a camera? I looked up and my blood ran cold. There in the corner of the bedroom was a tiny black dome, a security camera, partially hidden by a plant. What the hell? I muttered, grabbing a chair to get a closer look. As I examined it, I realized with growing horror that it was real and it was on. We tore through the house our earlier unease, exploding into full-blown panic. We found cameras in every room, some hidden behind pictures, others disguised as smoke detectors. Our private weekend, Gway, had turned into a sick surveillance experiment. We need to leave, Claire said, her voice shaking. Now I agreed, but as we started to pack our things, we heard a key in the lock. The door swung open and there stood Roger. That too wide smile still plastered on his face. Is everything all right? He asked, his eyes darting between us and our half-packed bags. I thought I heard some commotion. We're leaving, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. We found the cameras. This is completely unacceptable. Roger's smile didn't falter, but something changed in his eyes. A coldness crept in, replacing the manic cheerfulness from earlier cameras. He said, feigning innocence. Oh, those old things. They're not even connected, just left over from the previous owners. Nothing to worry about. They're on. CLA snapped. We saw the lights. We're not stupid. Roger's smile finally dropped. He stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. Now, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Let's not do anything hasty, you've only just arrived. It would be a shame to cut your stay short. I stepped in front of Claire, my heart pounding. We're leaving, I repeated. Get out of our way. Roger didn't move. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, I've grown quite fond of you both already. I think you'll find that extending your stay will be in everyone's best interest. The implication in his words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Claire, saw the fear in her eyes and made a split-second decision. I lunged at Roger, catching him off guard. We tumbled to the floor, grappling for control. CLA, run, I shouted. She didn't hesitate, grabbing our bags and bolting for the door. Roger was stronger than he looked, and it took everything I had to keep him pinned down. I heard the car start outside and knew CLA had made it out. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to break free from Roger's grasp. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I jumped into the passenger seat of our car, just as CLA was pulling away from the curb. As we sped down the street, I saw Roger in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching us go. Even from a distance, I could see that terrifying smile was back on his face. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were several towns over. We found a motel, paid cash and holed up for the night, jumping at every sound. The next day we reported everything to the police and to Airbnb, but when the authorities went to investigate, they found the house empty. No cameras. No, Roger, no evidence of anything amiss. It was as if our entire nightmarish experience had been a shared hallucination. We tried to move on to forget about that weekend, but sometimes late at night I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear breathing on the other side of the door. I check my phone obsessively for hidden apps, scan my apartment for tiny lenses, and every time I pass a house with blue shutters and a red door, I can't help but wonder, is Roger in there waiting for his next unsuspecting guests? Are there other houses out there filled with hidden cameras and hosts with too wide smiles? I'll never use Airbnb again. Hotels might be more expensive, But at least their anonymity is part of the deal. No overly friendly hosts. No perfectly manicured lawns hiding sinister secrets. Claire and I are still together, but that weekend left its mark on us. We're more cautious now, more aware of the potential dangers lurking behind friendly faces and good deals. We've learned the hard way that sometimes the price of privacy is higher than any savings on accommodations. So if you're ever booking a place to stay and the deal seems too good to be true, remember our story. Look for the cameras hidden in plain sight, and if your host seems a little too interested in your plans, a little too eager to make you feel at home, trust your instincts, because you never know who might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to turn your vacation into a prison, and once you're caught in their web, it might be too late to escape. The suburbs might look peaceful, with their identical houses and neatly trimmed hedges. But behind those picket fences and red doors, darkness can lurk, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who invite you in with a smile. I always thought I knew my neighborhood like the back of my hand, every street, every corner, every shortcut. But on that moonless night, as footsteps echoed behind me and familiar roads twisted into an endless maze, I realized how little I truly knew about the dark corners of my own backyard. It had been a long night at the office by the time I left. The streets were empty, the last stragglers from nearby bars long gone. I decided to walk home, figuring the cool night air would help clear my head. It was a route I'd taken 100 times before, a straight shot through residential areas that would get me home in 20 minutes flat. The first few blocks were uneventful. Street lights cast pools of yellow light on the sidewalk, and the hum of distant traffic provided a comforting urban lullaby. I was lost in thought, mentally reviewing tomorrow's to-do list when I first heard footsteps slightly out of sync with my own. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was empty. Shaking my head, I pressed on, probably just an echo, I told myself. Or maybe a cat prowling the night. But the footsteps continued, growing slightly louder with each passing minute. I picked up my pace, my heart rate quickening to match my steps. Another look back revealed nothing but shadows. I turned onto Cedar Street, a quiet residential road lined with old Victorian houses. As I passed under a flickering streetlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure tall and lean standing at the far end of the block. Even from this distance, I could tell they were staring directly at me. Fight. ORF flight. Instinct kicked in and I chose flight. I turned sharply onto Maple Avenue. A street I knew would lead me straight home. But as I hurried along, something felt off. The houses looked different, older, and more run down than I remembered. Had I taken a wrong turn, the footsteps behind me grew louder, more insistent. I broke into a run, no longer caring if I looked foolish. All I wanted was to get home, to lock my door and forget this night ever happened. I turned on to what I thought was my street, only to find myself facing an unfamiliar cul-de-sac. Panic started to set in. How was this possible? I'd lived in this neighborhood for years. There shouldn't be any streets I didn't recognize. The sound of footsteps was closer now, echoing off the houses around me. I spun around, ready to confront whoever was following me, but the street behind me was as empty as the one ahead. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response, just the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I pulled out my phone, intending to call for help or at least use the GPS to figure out where I was, but the screen remained stubbornly dark, dead battery of all the nights. For this to happen, with no other choice, I pressed on, trying to retrace my steps, but each turn led me deeper into unfamiliar territory. Streets I'd never seen before stretched out in front of me, lined with houses that seemed to leer in the darkness. The footsteps continued, sometimes fading into the distance, only to return louder than ever. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between houses, a figure watching from a darkened window, but every time I turned to look there was nothing there. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered through this twisted version of my neighborhood. My feet HDHD, my throat was dry from panic, and exhaustion tugged at the edges of my consciousness, but still I couldn't find my way home. As I turned yet another corner, I saw something that made my heart leap, a familiar street sign, Elm Street. My street relief flooded through me as I started down the road, my pace quickening with each step. But as I approached my house, that relief turned to icy dread. The building before me looked like my home, but wrong. The paint was peeling, the windows dark and empty. The neat front lawn I'd mowed just last weekend was overgrown. Weeds choking out the carefully tended flowers. I stood there staring at this nightmare version of my house. When I heard footsteps right behind me, I whirled around ready to face my pursuer, but what I saw defied explanation. The street behind me was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. And emerging from that darkness was a figure. No multiple figures, shadowy, featureless forms that moved with an unnatural grace. Terror, unlike anything I'd ever known, gripped me. I ran, no longer caring about direction or logic. I just needed to get away, to escape this impossible, nightmarish version of my neighborhood. Streets blurred past as I fled, each one stranger and more twisted than the last. Houses loomed overhead, their architecture growing more bizarre. With each block I passed by buildings that seemed to defy gravity, streets that looped back on themselves in impossible ways, and always, the footsteps followed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this labyrinth, the nightmare. But eventually my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As I lay there waiting for the shadows to overtake me, I heard something new. A voice call my name, Tom Tom. Wake up. The world around me began to blur and fade. The twisted houses, the impossible streets, all of it dissolved into a swirling mist. I opened my eyes to find myself at my desk at work, my colleague shaking my shoulder. Gently, "You were having quite a nightmare," she said. Concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" I nodded, still disoriented, my heart racing from the lingering fear of the dream. "Yeah, I'm fine, just a bad dream." As I gathered my things to head home, relief washed over me. It had all been a dream, a terrifying, vivid dream, but a dream nonetheless. But as I stepped out of the office into the dark night, a chill ran down my spine. The streets looked different, unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, and as I started my walk home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere behind me, just out of sight, footsteps echoed in the darkness. I quickened my pace, suddenly very eager to get home and lock my door. But with each turn the streets seemed to shift and change. What should have been familiar landmarks were distorted as if seen through a funhouse mirror. Panic started to creep in as I realized I didn't recognize where I was. This couldn't be happening. It was just a dream, wasn't it? But the sound of footsteps growing closer told me otherwise. This was real, somehow impossibly, terrifyingly real. I started to run, no longer caring about looking foolish or attracting attention. All I wanted was to get home, to escape this nightmare that had somehow bled into reality. But with each turn, each desperate sprint down unfamiliar streets, I knew the truth. I was lost, trapped in a maze of my own neighborhood, with something dark and unknowable in pursuit. And as the footsteps grew ever closer, I realized that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide under our beds or in our closets. Sometimes they're the ones that transform the familiar into the unrecognizable, that turn our safe havens into labyrinths of fear. I'm still running, still trying to find my way home, and I know that somewhere out there in the twisted streets of this nightmare version of my neighborhood, those footsteps are still following. Waiting for the moment, I slow down for the instant, I let my guard drop, so I keep moving, keep searching for a way out of this maze, because I know that if I stop, if I let those footsteps catch up to me, I may never find my way home again. And in the back of my mind a terrifying thought lingers. What if I'm not the only one trapped here? What if there are others lost in their own familiar yet foreign neighborhoods, running from footsteps that never tire, never slow? So if you ever find yourself on a dark street, that should be familiar, but isn't. If you hear footsteps echoing behind you in the night, remember my story and run and pray. You find your way home before the darkness swallows you whole. The first rule of urban exploration is to never go alone. The second is to always trust your instincts. I broke both rules that night, and what I found in that abandoned building will haunt me. For the rest of my life I've always been drawn to forgotten places. There's something eerily beautiful about a building left to decay nature, slowly reclaiming what was once a bustling hub of human activity. I'd been photographing abandoned structures for years, each expedition, a thrilling mix of art and adrenaline. The old Hartley factory had been on my radar for months. A massive complex on the outskirts of town. It had been shuttered for decades. Its hulking silhouette, a stark reminder of the city's industrial past, getting inside had proven challenging. The place was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, and local security patrols were known to be vigilant. But on that fateful night I finally saw my chance. A storm had knocked down a section of the fence, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. I knew I should wait, should call my usual exploration partner, should at least tell someone where I was going. But the opportunity was too perfect to pass up. Armed with my camera, a flashlight, and a backpack full of supplies, I made my way to the factory under the cover of darkness. The gap in the fence was still there, an inviting portal to urban decay. I slipped through my heart, racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The factory loomed before me, a behemoth of rusted metal and broken windows. Moonlight filtered through the gaps, casting long shadows across the overgrown courtyard. I took a moment to capture a few exterior shots before making my way to a side entrance. The door creaked open with surprising ease, as if welcoming me into its long-forgotten hall. The smell hit me first, a musty combination of damp concrete, rusted metal and something else I couldn't quite place. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a vast open space filled with silent machinery. I moved slowly, carefully, my camera at the ready. Every step echoed in the cavernous room, the sound bouncing off walls adorned with peeling paint and graffiti. I lost myself in the photography, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the textures of decay, the stories told in abandoned objects. I don't know how long I'd been exploring when I first heard it, a soft sound barely audible over my own movements. I paused, holding my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a faint shuffling, like something being dragged across concrete. My first thought was that it must be an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a stray cat that had found its way inside. But as I stood there, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, more. This was no animal. I switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My eyes struggled to adjust as I pressed myself against a wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from deeper within the factory, from a hallway I hadn't yet explored. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out. While I still could, but curiosity, that damned human trait, got the better of me. I had to know what was making that sound. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept towards the hallway. The shuffling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I reached the entrance to the corridor and peered around the corner. My blood ran cold. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure, humanoid in shape, but wrong. Somehow. Its proportions were off, limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. It was facing away from me, its head cocked, as if listening. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a stumble, I'm not sure, but suddenly it turned in the dim light, filtering through a broken window. I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather where a face should have been. Instead, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternal. We stared at each other. Then, with a sound that was part shriek and part static, it began to move towards me. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, my feet pounding against the concrete floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, that awful shuffling gait growing faster, closer. I burst out of the side entrance into the moonlit courtyard. The gap in the fence seemed miles away. I sprinted towards it, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. Just as I reached the fence, I felt something brush against my back. I didn't look back, didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the gap, feeling the barbed wire tear at my clothes, at my skin. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked several blocks away. As I fumbled with my keys, I finally dared to look back. The street behind me was empty. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real. Maybe I'd breathed in some toxic fumes left over from the factory's operational days. Maybe the isolation and darkness had played tricks on my mind. But as I uploaded the photos from my camera, I realized with growing horror that it had been all too real. There in the background of one of my shots, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, long limbs, unnatural posture, and that smooth, featureless face. I deleted the photos, all of them. I scrubbed my hard drive, destroyed the memory card. I wanted no record of that night, no evidence of what I'd seen. But I can't erase the memory, can't shake the feeling that I didn't just encounter something in that factory. I awakened it, and now, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear, I can hear a faint shuffling outside my window. I don't go urban exploring anymore, can't bring myself to enter abandoned buildings, even in broad daylight, because now I know that sometimes the places we think are empty are anything. But sometimes, in the forgotten corners of our world, things wait, patient, hungry things that should not be, and sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might just catch their attention. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night, tried to convince myself. It was all in my head, a product of fear and an overactive imagination. But deep down I know the truth. I know that in that abandoned factory I encountered something that defies explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I've done research since then, diving deep into urban legends and conspiracy theories. I found whispers of similar encounters, stories of explorers who ventured into abandoned places and never returned or came back changed. There are names for these entities: skin, walkers, wendigos, things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. But names don't matter. What matters is that they're out there, waiting in the dark, empty places of our world, and once you've seen them, once you've caught their attention, you're never truly safe again. I've moved since that night, left the city entirely. I live in a small town now surrounded by people and light, but even here I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there that thing from the factory is looking for me, being its time. So I keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn, I don't go out at night, and I never ever explore abandoned buildings. Because I know now that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the ghosts of the past that link in those forgotten places. Sometimes it's the things that have always been there, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb their slumber. If you're an urban explorer, if you're drawn to the allure of abandoned places, heed my warning. Never go alone, always trust your instincts, and if you hear a shuffling in the darkness, if you catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, run and don't look back, because once they've seen you, once they know you're there, it might already be too late. As for me, I'll keep running, keep hiding, and I'll pray that one day the memory of that faceless figure will fade, that the sound of shuffling footsteps will no longer haunt my dreams. But deep down I know the truth. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some encounters change you forever, leaving you forever looking over your shoulder, for forever wondering what lurks in the shadows of the world. We thought we knew the kindness of strangers can be a double-edged sword. One moment you're grateful for the help, the next you're fighting for your life. I learned this lesson on a lonely stretch of road where a good Samaritan's smile hid the darkest of intentions. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just me, my old reliable car, and the open highway stretching out before me. I'd made this drive a dozen times before visiting my sister, who lived 3 states over, but this time fate had other plans. The trouble started about halfway through my journey. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. I was tired, but the coffee from my last rest stop was doing its job, keeping me alert enough to navigate the empty stretches of highway. That's when I heard it, a strange rattling sound coming from under the hood. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping it was just road debris or my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder. More insistent then, without warning, my car began to sputter. The engine coughed and wheezed, and I felt the vehicle losing power. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. I managed to guide the car onto the shoulder, just as it gave its final gasping shudder and died. I sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the situation. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, my phone showing no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Just as panic began to set in, I saw headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as a pickup truck slowed and pulled up behind me. Maybe my luck was turning around after all. A man stepped out of the truck, his features obscured by the glare of his headlights. As he approached my window, I could make out more details. He was tall, probably in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap. "Having some trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff, but not unkind. I nodded, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Yeah, my car just died on me." "I don't suppose you know anything about engines," he chuckled. "As a matter of fact, I do. Pop the hood and let's take a look." I did, as he asked, grateful for the help. As he leaned over the engine, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what looks like your alternator shot," he said. "After a few minutes I can try to start it, but you won't get far. There's a town about 20 miles up the road with a mechanic. I can give you a tow if you'd like." I hesitated. The offer was tempting, but the idea of getting into a stranger's truck in the middle of the night made me uneasy. As if sensing my reluctance, he gave me a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'm not some axe murderer," he joked. "Just a guy trying to help out, name's Mike. By the way." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Mike seemed friendly enough and I didn't have many other options. As he hitched my car to his truck, I gathered my purse and phone, sending up a silent prayer that I was making the right decision. The first few miles were uneventful. Mike kept up a steady stream of small talk, asking about my trip and commenting on the weather. But as we drove deeper into the night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. We had passed a sign for the town he'd mentioned, but instead of turning off, Mike kept driving straight ahead. I think we missed the turn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Mike's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Oh, did? We must have been distracted." "No worries, I know a shortcut," but we didn't turn around. We just kept driving, the miles stretching out before us, taking us further and further from civilization. The unease I'd felt earlier bloomed into full-blown fear. "Where are we going?" I demanded, no longer able to hide the tremor in my voice. Mike's friendly demeanor vanished in an instant. His face hardened, and when he looked at me, his eyes were cold and empty. "Somewhere quiet," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Somewhere no one will hear you scream." Terror gripped me. This couldn't be happening. This was the stuff of nightmares and true crime podcasts, not something that happened to real people like me. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out of the moving vehicle if I had to, but Mike was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he growled. "We're going awful fast, might hurt yourself." My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. I thought about my phone, but even if I could reach it, there was still no signal. I was trapped, hurtling through the darkness, with a man whose intentions were becoming clearer by the second. As we rounded a curve, I saw something that made my heart leap, headlights in the distance and coming towards us. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Without thinking, I lunged across Mike, grabbing the steering wheel and jerking it hard to the right. The truck swerved violently. Mike cursed, trying to regain control, but it was too late. We keyed off the road, the world outside the windshield becoming a dizzying blur of trees and sky. The impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and for a moment everything went black. When I came to chow, the truck was on its side, smoke billowing from the crumpled hood. Mike was slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. Pain radiated through my body, but adrenaline pushed it aside. I had to get out, had to get away. I fumbled with my seat belt, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. Finally it released and I half fell, half crawled out of the shattered passenger window. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I could hear voices in the distance, the other driver coming to investigate the crash, but I couldn't wait for them. I didn't know if Mike was still alive, still a threat. I stumbled into the woods branches, whipping at my face, roots, threatening to trip me with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance between myself and that truck as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the dark forest, but eventually my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As I lay there, leaves crunching beneath me, the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I began to sob, the sound echoing in the empty woods. I was lost, injured and alone, but I was alive. I had escaped. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I heard something that made me want to cry with relief. Sirens, search parties looking for survivors of the crash. I stumbled towards the sound, waving my arms and shouting Healy. When the rescue workers found me, I was a mess, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and dirty, but I was alive. Mike, they told me later, hadn't been so lucky. He died on impact. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process my trauma, I learned the full extent of Mike's crimes. He'd been responsible for a string of disappearances along that highway, all women traveling alone. I had been intended to be his next victim. Now, years later, I still can't drive long distances alone. The sight of a pickup truck on a dark road is enough to send me into a panic attack. But I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm telling my story because the truth is, the world can be a dangerous place. Kindness can be a mask for cruelty, and help can be a trap. But we're strong, stronger than we know, capable of fighting back even in our darkest moments. So if you're ever stranded on a lonely road and a stranger offers help, remember my story, be cautious, trust your instincts, and never, ever, be afraid to fight for your life. Because sometimes the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor is a split-second decision to take control of your own fate. And to Mike, wherever his twisted soul ended up, I have one final message: you picked the wrong woman to mess with. I survived, I'm thriving, and your legacy will be nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil doesn't always win. Sometimes the prey becomes the predator and the hunter becomes the hunted. They say curiosity killed the cat, but they never mention what happens when the cat stumbles upon something it was never meant to find. Deep in the heart of an unexplored cave system, I discovered a truth that shook me to my core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our world. I've always been an avid caver, drawn to the thrill of exploring the unknown depths beneath our feet. There's something magical about venturing into places where few humans have ever set foot, illuminating ancient rock formations that have existed in darkness for millions of years. It's a hobby that's taken me to some of the most remote corners of the world, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in the Hollow Creek caves. The Hollow Creek system had been on my radar for years. Located in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, it was rumored to be vast and largely unexplored. Local legends spoke of strange noises echoing from its depths of spelunkers who entered and never returned. Most serious cavers dismissed these stories as campfire tales, but they only fueled my curiosity. After months of planning and obtaining the necessary permits, I set out on what I thought would be a routine solo exploration. The cave entrance was hidden behind a thick curtain of vegetation, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. As I switched on my headlamp and ducked into the narrow opening, I felt the familiar rush of excitement that always accompanied a new adventure. The first few hours were uneventful. I carefully mapped my progress, marveling at the intricate formations of stalactites and stalagmites that adorned the cavern walls. The air was cool and damp, filled with the steady drip of water that had shaped these caves over millennia. It was when I reached a large chamber about a mile into the system that things began to feel off. The chamber was massive, its ceiling lost in darkness above me. But what caught my attention were the walls. They were smooth, almost polished in a way that seemed decidedly unnatural, and there, carved into the rock faux, were symbols I'd never seen before. They weren't petroglyphs or any known ancient script. These were complex geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer slightly. In the beam of my headlamp, I approached the wall, running my hand over the strange markings. They were cool to the touch, but I could have sworn. I felt a slight vibration, as if the rock itself was humming with some hidden energy. As I examined the symbols more closely, I noticed something else, a faint draft coming from behind the carved wall. My heart raced as I realized what this might mean, a hidden passage, perhaps leading to an entirely unexplored section of the cave. I searched the wall carefully, looking for any sign of an opening. After several minutes, I found it a small indentation that, when pressed, caused a section of the wall to slide away with a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber. I hesitated at the threshold of this new passage. Every instinct honed from years of caving was screaming at me to turn back, to not venture into an unmapped area alone, but the allure of discovery was too strong. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the opening. The passage beyond was unlike anything I'd ever seen in a natural cave. The walls were perfectly smooth, the floor level, and even it looked less like a cavern and more like a tunnel carved by intelligent hands. My unease grew with every step, but so did my curiosity. As I ventured deeper, I began to hear something, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the very rock around me. It was barely audible at first, but grew louder as I progressed. The air too began to change. It became warmer, heavy, with an electric charge that made the hair on my arms stand on end. After what felt like hours of walking, the tunnel opened into another chamber, and what I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The room was vast, its walls covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen earlier. But it was what lay at the center that truly defied explanation. A pillar of swirling energy rose from the floor to the ceiling, pulsing with colors I'd never seen before. Colors that shouldn't exist around it were arranged. What looked like control panels covered in more of those bizarre symbols, and there, hunched over one of the panels, was a figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Tall and slender, with limbs that bent at impossible angles, its skin seemed to shift and ripple like the surface of an oil slick. As I stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief, it turned where a face should have been. There was only a smooth, featureless expanse, yet somehow I knew it was looking right at me. I felt its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on me into me for a moment that stretched into eternity. We stared at each other. Then, with a sound that was part shriek and part static, it began to move towards me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a stop motion. Animation brought to terrifying life. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my heart pounding so hard. I thought it might burst from my chest. I could hear it behind me, that awful shrieking. Getting closer, the symbols on the walls seemed to blur as I raced past, and I swear I saw some of them move, rearranging themselves as if trying to block my path. I don't know how I found my way back to the main chamber. Everything was a blur of panic and adrenaline, but suddenly I was there, scrambling through the hidden door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the cave entrance into the blessed light of day. As I stood there gasping for breath, I turned to look back at the cave. The entrance looked just as it had when I'd arrived, a simple opening in the rock face, giving no hint of the impossibilities that lay within. For a wild moment I wondered if I'd imagined it all, but the terror coursing through my veins was all too real. I've never gone back to Hollow Creek, never told anyone the full story of what I saw down there. Who would believe me? Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly shriek ringing in my ears. I've pored over every book, every legend I can find, searching for some explanation for what I encountered. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world, perhaps not even of this world, that defy all our understanding. The symbols haunt my dreams. Sometimes I find myself absent-mindedly sketching them, only to rip up the paper in fear, because I can't shake the feeling that they're more than just writing. They're a key to something vast and ancient and utterly alien. I don't go caving anymore, can't bring myself to venture into the dark, knowing what might be lurking there. But sometimes when I'm in a crowded city street or a busy shopping mall, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a too tall figure, a smooth, featureless face. It's gone. When I turn to look, but I know it was there. They're among us, hidden watching, waiting for what I don't know. But I do know this. The world is stranger and more terrifying than we can possibly imagine, and sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the ones that lurk in the darkness, but the ones that hide in plain sight, just beyond the edge of our understanding. So if you're ever exploring a cave and you come across symbols that shouldn't be there, or hear sounds that don't belong in our world, remember my story, turn back, run and pray that you haven't already been noticed by whatever watches from the shadows. Because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The knowledge will haunt you, change you, and leave you forever wondering what other secrets lie hidden in the dark places of our world. The first night I told myself it was just the house settling. By the third night I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until the fifth night that I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in that sprawling country home, and whatever was with me wasn't human. It started, innocently enough. My best friend, Sarah, had asked me to house sit for her while she and her husband took a much-needed vacation. Their home was a beautiful old farmhouse nestled in the countryside, about an hour outside the city. It was the kind of place I'd always dreamed of, owning spacious rooms, a wraparound porch and acres of land stretching out in every direction. "It'll be like a vacation for you too," Sarah had said with a laugh. "Just you, peace and quiet and miles of nothing." If only she'd known how wrong she'd be. The first day was idyllic. I spent the morning exploring the house, admiring the antique furniture and the way the sunlight streamed through the large windows. In the afternoon I took a long walk around the property, breathing in the fresh country air and reveling in the solitude. As night fell, I settled into the cozy living room with a book and a glass of wine. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs, like something heavy being set down. I froze, my book forgotten in my lap. Sarah had mentioned that their cat Milo was staying with the neighbor. The house should have been empty, except for me. I listened intently, but the sound wasn't repeated. After a few minutes I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old buildings make all sorts of noises, right? I finished my wine and headed to bed, pushing the incident out of my mind. The second night passed uneventfully, lulling me into a false sense of security. But on the third night things took a turn. I was in the kitchen washing up after dinner when I heard it, footsteps clear as day, coming from the floor above. They were slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. My heart began to race. There was no mistaking at this time. Someone was in the house. I grabbed a knife from the counter and crept towards the stairs, my palms sweating as I gripped the handle. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" Silence. The footsteps had stopped. I climbed the stairs slowly, every creak of the old wood sending a jolt of fear through me. When I reached the top, I flicked on the lights. The hallway was empty. All the doors closed, just as I'd left them. I checked every room, looking under beds and in closets, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no open windows, nothing out of place. I told myself I must have imagined it, that the silence of the countryside was playing tricks on my catchened ears. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fourth night I decided to be proactive. I double-checked all the locks, closed every curtain and even set up a makeshift alarm system with empty cans by the doors. I was determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing these disturbances. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a crash from downstairs, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and the heavy flashlight I'd placed by the bed. As I crept down the stairs, I could hear movement in the living room, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I burst into the room, flashlight beam sweeping wildly, ready to confront the intruder, but what I saw made me question my sanity. The heavy oak coffee table was in the center of the room, exactly where it had always been, but the rug beneath it was bunched up as if the table had been moved and then returned to its original position. And there on the hardwood floor were marks, long, deep scratches that hadn't been there. When I'd gone to bed, I backed out of the room, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. Furniture doesn't move on its own. Floors don't scratch themselves, but I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't done this. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, lights on, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I seriously considered leaving, but the thought of trying to explain this to Sarah, of admitting that I'd been spooked by noises in the night like a child, kept me there. I was determined to see this through, to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. I wish I'd left when I had had the chance. The fifth night started quietly, too quietly. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, the rustle of wind through trees, were absent. It was as if the world outside had been muted, leaving only an oppressive silence. I was in the study trying to distract myself with one of the many books lining the shelves. When I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, the warm summer air turned icy, my breath fogging in front of me. Then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a voice, but not like any human voice I'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. At once. "You don't belong here," it said, the words reverberating through my very bones. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Show yourself." A chuckle, low and menacing, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Oh, but I have the voice," replied. "I've been showing myself all along. You just haven't been looking properly." As if, in response to these words, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, taking on shapes that defied logic. Limbs too long, angles too sharp to be human. I ran out of the study, down the stairs, heading for the front door, but as I reached for the handle I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and screamed. A hand, dark as smoke and just as insubstantial, had emerged from the floorboards. As I watched in horror, an arm followed, then a shoulder. The thing pulling itself out of the floor was only vaguely humanoid, its form shifting and roiling like a storm cloud, leaving so soon. The voice mocked, now seeming to come from the creature itself. "But we've only just begun." I kicked free and yanked open the door, running out into the night. The cool grass under my bare feet, the fresh air on my face. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then I turned back to look at the house. Every window was filled with writhing shadows pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. And there on the porch stood a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Where its face should have been was only darkness deeper than the night sky. It raised a hand, long fingers, unfurling in a mocking wave. "Run all you like." The voice echoed in my head. "But remember, I was here first and I'll be here long after you're gone." I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, my feet blooded and my lungs burning. A passing motorist took pity on me, the wild-eyed woman in pajamas, and drove me to the nearest town. I never went back to that house. I called Sarah from a hotel room, babbling some excuse about a family emergency. She was understanding, concerned even, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? It's been years now, but I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly voice ringing in my ears. I've moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise and light and people, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there waiting. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, a figure you're just at the edge of my vision, and I'll remember the last words I heard as I fled into the night. "I'll be here long after you're gone." So if you ever find yourself alone in an old country house and you hear noises, you can't explain or see things that shouldn't be there, remember my story. Don't try to rationalize it, don't try to be brave. Just run, and don't look back, because some things are better left undisturbed and some houses are never truly empty. The old factory stood silent, a hulking shadow against the night sky. But as I stepped inside for my first shift as the night security guard, I realized that silent was the last word I'd used to describe this place. Some buildings sleep at night. This one came alive, and what stirred in its depths was never meant to be seen by human eyes. I needed the job. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove through the rusted gates of the abandoned Blackwater manufacturing plant. The economy had hit our small town hard and jobs were scarce. When I saw the ad for a night security guard, I jumped at the opportunity. The pay was good and the job seemed simple enough. Patrol the grounds. Make sure no one broke in. Report any suspicious activity. Easy, right? The manager who hired me, a nervous man named Frank, had been vague about why they needed security for an empty building. "Just a precaution," he'd said. Not meeting my eyes. Vandals, kids looking for a thrill. As I parked my car in the empty lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that Frank hadn't told me everything. The factory loomed before me, its broken windows, like dead eyes staring down at me. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just an old building, nothing more. I let myself in with the key. Frank had given me the heavy door, groaning as it swung open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a reception area thick with dust and cobwebs. Old machinery sat silently in the shadows. Their once gleaming surfaces now dull and rusted. My footsteps echoed as I began my first round. The building was massive, a labyrinth of corridors and cavernous rooms filled with abandoned equipment. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak and groan of the old structure set my nerves on edge. It was about 2 hours into my shift when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a soft whirring like machinery coming to life. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from the east wing, an area Frank had specifically told me not to enter. Common sense told me to ignore it, to continue my rounds and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I found myself walking towards the sound, my flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me. As I approached the east wing, the whirring grew louder. It was joined by other sounds, clanking, grinding, the hiss of steam. It sounded as if the entire factory had come to life. I pushed open the door to the main production floor and stopped dead in my tracks. The room was alive with motion. Conveyor belts moved, carrying nothing. Robot arms swung back and forth, assembling invisible products, and in the center of it all, a massive machine pulsed with an eerie blue light. This was impossible. The power had been cut to this building years ago. There was no way any of this should be working. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I noticed something else, shadows moving between the machines. They were human-shaped but wrong, somehow too tall, too thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. One of the shadows turned towards me and I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. But as the shadow figure began to move towards me, I knew this was no dream. This was a nightmare come to life. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making behind me. I could hear more of those things joining the pursuit, their footsteps echoing off the walls. I burst out of the east wing, slamming the door behind me, but the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. The whirring and clanking spread, and I realized with horror that the entire factory was waking up. I ran through the corridors, my flashlight beamed, bouncing wildly. Machines I had passed earlier were now active, their gears grinding as they performed tasks for unseen masters, and everywhere those shadow figures moved, always just at the edge of my vision. I finally reached the main entrance, my hands shaking so badly. I could barely grip the door handle. As I yanked it open, I heard a voice behind me, a sound that was more in my head than in my ears. "You don't belong here," it said. "It's cold and inhuman. This is our time." I didn't look back. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The factory was fully illuminated. Now every window blazing with that strange blue light, and there, standing in the doorway, was a group of those featureless figures watching me drive away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hand shaking on the steering wheel when I finally pulled over. I sat there for a long time trying to make sense of what I had seen. None of it was possible, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that it had all been real. I called Frank the next morning and quit. He didn't sound surprised. "Did you see them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied, not needing to ask what he meant. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry." He finally said, "I should have warned you, but would you have believed me?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was, if he had told me what really happened in that factory at night, I would have thought he was crazy. In the weeks that followed, I tried to forget what I had seen. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, maybe something I had eaten, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was happening in that old factory, something that defied explanation. I've done research since then, diving into old town records and local legends. I found whispers of strange occurrences dating back to when the factory was first built, workers who disappeared without a trace, machinery that operated on its own, and always sightings of those featureless figures. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of grinding gears and inhuman footsteps ringing in my ears. I'll look out my window half expecting to see those shadow figures standing in my yard watching me with their non-existent eyes. I don't know what they are or what they want. Are they ghosts, aliens, some kind of interdimensional beings? All I know is that they exist, and they're still there in that old factory, doing whatever it is they do when the sun goes down. I've thought about going to the authorities, but who would believe me? And, more importantly, What if they investigated and disturbed whatever fragile balance exists between our world and whatever world those things come from? So I keep my secret and I warn people to stay away from the old Blackwater plant. It's not safe. I'll say the structure is unstable. It's not the whole truth, but it's enough to keep people away, and that's what matters, because some things are better left undisturbed, some secrets are better left uncovered, and some places like that old factory are meant to be left alone when night falls. If you ever find yourself driving past an abandoned building late at night and you see lights on when there shouldn't be any, or hear machinery running when everything should be silent, remember my story. Don't investigate, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Just keep driving and be grateful that the barrier between our world and theirs remains intact for now. A single flat tire on a deserted back road, that's all it took for our world to turn upside down, for the line between reality and nightmare to blur beyond recognition. We thought we were just unlucky travelers. We had no idea we were about to become pawns in a game as old as the hills themselves. My wife, Sarah, and I were on our way back from a weekend getaway. We'd spent 2 blissful days at a quaint bed and breakfast, reconnecting and escaping the stress of our daily lives. As we drove home, the sun dipping below the horizon, we were relaxed and happy, already planning our next trip. That's when we heard it, the telltale thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, the tall grass, rushing against the side of our car. We were miles from the nearest town on a winding back road. We'd taken as a scenic route home. It's okay, I reassured Sarah as I got out to assess the damage. I'll have us back on the road in no time. But as I opened the trunk to get the spare, I realized with a sinking feeling that our luck had truly run out. The spare was flat too, the result of neglect and overconfidence. We were stranded. I pulled out my phone hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, why would anything go right at this point? We'll just have to wait for someone to drive by, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt someone's bound to come along. Eventually Sarah nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The road was deserted and the encroaching darkness made the surrounding woods seem ominous and forbid-bidding. As we stood there debating our options, I noticed something strange. Carved into the trunk of a nearby tree was a symbol, a crude circle with a line through it. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except I suddenly realized I'd seen the same symbol a few miles back, spray painted on an old barn. "Hey, Sarah," I called out, "come look at this." She walked over her brow, furrowing, as she examined the carving. "Weird," she muttered. "Do you think it means something?" Before I could answer, we heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Relief washed over me as I saw headlights appear around the bend. It was an old pickup truck slowing down as it neared us. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and a worn baseball cap, rolled down his window. "You folks having some trouble?" he asked, his voice, gruff but not unkind. I explained our situation and he nodded. "Simp SYP, pathetically. Tell you what he said. I've got a pump in the back. Let me see if I can get that spare inflated for you." As he worked on the tire, making small talk about the weather and the tricky nature of these back roads, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about this whole situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. That's when I noticed it. Another of those strange symbols, this time painted on the side of the man's truck. It was partially obscured by mud, but unmistakably the same design. I was about to mention it to Sarah when I heard the sound of another vehicle approaching, and another and another. Within minutes, we were surrounded by a half-dozen cars and trucks, all having appeared as if from nowhere. The drivers got out, forming a loose circle around us. They were a mixed group, men and women, young and old, but they all had the same blank expression, the same unsettling stillness. The old man straightened up from his work on the tire, a smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice taking on a strange sing-song. "Quality, looks like we've got ourselves some visitors." Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "John," she whispered, "we need to leave now," but there was nowhere to go. We were hemmed in on all sides, the circle of silent observers slowly closing in around us. "What's going on?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "What do you want from us?" The old man chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. Want? Oh, we don't want anything from you. You're the ones who came to us. Remember, you're the ones who saw the signs. Signs? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. You mean those symbols? A murmur ran through the crowd and I saw several of them nod, approvingly. Smart girl. The old man said yes, the symbols. Markers for those who know how to look. Invitations, you might say invitations to what I asked, though a part of me didn't want to know the answer. The old man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous to the gathering, of course, to the harvest. As he spoke those words, the air around us seemed to change. The temperature dropped and a mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around our feet. The people surrounding us started to chant a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I looked at Sarah, saw the terror in her eyes that must have mirrored my own. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke or a hallucination, but the chill in the air, the growing pressure in my head, it all felt terrifyingly real. Please, I said, hating the pleading tone in my voice. We don't want any trouble. Just let us go and we'll forget this ever happened. The old man laughed and this time the others joined in. It was a horrible sound, more akin to the sea of crows than human laughter. Oh, my boy, he said, shaking his head as if I'd said something terribly naive, and it's far too late for that. You've been chosen. The old ones are hungry and you've wandered right into their feeding grounds. As he spoke, I began to notice changes in the people around us. Their features seemed to blur and shift, becoming less human. With each passing second, limbs elongated, fingers stretching into claws and their faces their faces began to melt away, leaving smooth, blank expanses of skin. Sarah screamed the sound piercing through the chanting. I grabbed her hand and made a desperate lunge for the gap between two of the creatures, hoping against hope that we could break through their circle. For a moment I thought we'd made it. We burst through the line, our feet pounding against the asphalt as we ran blindly into the night. But then I heard it, the sound of pursuit. Not the heavy footfalls I expected, but a sort of slithering, squelching noise that turned my stomach. We ran until our lungs burned, until the taste of blood filled my mouth. But no matter how fast we went, the sounds behind us never faded. If anything, they grew closer. Just as I thought we couldn't go on, I saw lights ahead, a gas station. Its fluorescent glow, a beacon of hope. In the darkness, we stumbled towards it, gasping for breath. As we burst into the harsh light of the parking lot, I risked a glance behind us. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The road behind us was empty. No pursuers, no monstrous creatures, just an empty stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. The attendant looked up as we crashed through the door, his eyes widening at our disheveled appearance. You folks, okay, he asked. Already, reaching for the phone, I opened my mouth to explain, to pour out the story of what had just happened. But as I met Sarah's eyes, I saw the same realization dawning there that I felt. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy, possibly drunk or high flat tire. Sarah managed to gasp out, had to run to find help. The attendant nodded sympathetically, buying our story without question. As he called a tow truck for us, I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. What had we just experienced? Was it real or some shared delusion brought on by stress and the isolation of that dark road? But as I sat there, I felt something in my pocket, something that hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out. It was a small wooden disc and, carved into its surface was that same symbol, a circle with a line through it. I quickly shoved it back into my pocket, my blood running cold, because I knew then that it had all been real. And I knew that somewhere out there in the darkness, beyond the lights of civilization, they were waiting for the next unwary travelers to see their signs to stumble into their trap. We never drove down back roads again. After that night we stuck to well-lit highways, always making sure our spare tire was in good condition. But sometimes, on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself looking out the window, half expecting to see those blank faces staring back at me. And I wonder how many others have seen those symbols, how many have been invited to the harvest and, most chillingly of all, How long before they decide to bring their ancient hungry gods to the cities where the hunting grounds are so much richer? So if you're ever driving down a lonely road at night and you see strange symbols carved into trees or painted on old barns, don't slow down, don't stop to investigate, just keep driving and pray that you haven't already been noticed, because once you've been chosen, once you've been marked for the harvest, there's no escaping the hunger of the old ones. The wilderness was supposed to clear my mind, not fill it with terror, but as I stared at the circle of rocks surrounding my tent, rocks that hadn't been there when I fell asleep, I realized that some things in nature aren't meant to be understood, only feared. I'd always been the outdoorsy type, finding solace in the quiet of the forest and the challenge of rugged terrain. But after a messy breakup and losing my job in the same week, I needed more than just a weekend hike. I needed to lose myself in the wilderness, to strip away the complications of modern life and find myself again. The Appalachian Trail seemed like the perfect solution, miles of pristine forest, challenging enough to occupy my body and mind, but well-traveled enough that I wouldn't be completely isolated. I packed light, just the essentials, a small tent sleeping bag, some dried food and basic survival gear. The plan was to hike for a week, maybe 2. However long it took to clear my head, the first few days were exactly what I needed. The physical exertion of climbing hills and navigating rough terrain left me pleasantly exhausted. Each night, the fresh air and stunning vistas worked like a balm on my troubled mind. I felt myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my chest slowly unraveling. It was on the 4th night that things began to change. I'd found a perfect little clearing to set up camp, far enough off the main trail to feel secluded, but not so far that I risked getting lost. As I sat by my small campfire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I felt truly at peace. For the first time in months, I must have dozed off there by the fire, because the next thing I knew I was waking up to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to embers and the night had grown cold. But that wasn't what had woken me. There was a sound just at the edge of hearing, a soft whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. As once I sat up instantly alert, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The whispering continued, rising and falling like waves on a shore. I couldn't make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like chanting hello. I called out my voice, sounding thin and scared in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a physical presence pressing in on me from all sides. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around my campsite. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. But as I swept the light around, something caught my eye. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a small pile of rocks. I frowned, certain that hadn't been there earlier. It was a simple stack, just 5 or 6 stones balanced on top of each other, probably just some fellow hiker marking the spot, I told myself. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd chosen this spot precisely because it was off the beaten path. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight, as if the thin fabric could protect me from whatever was out there. Sleep was long in coming, and when it did, it was filled with unsettling dreams of whispered voices and shadows moving just out of sight. I woke to bird song, the cheerful sound, a stark contrast to the eerie atmosphere of the night before. In the light of day, my fears seemed foolish. I'd probably imagined the whispering my mind playing tricks in the unfamiliar silence of the deep forest and the rock pile. Well, I must have just missed it when I set up camp. But as I crawled out of my tent, ready to laugh off my night terrors, I froze. The small pile of rocks I'd seen the night before was gone. In its place was a perfect circle of stone surrounding my entire campsite. My heart began to race. This was no trick of the mind, no half-remembered dream. Someone or something had been in my camp. While I slept, meticulously arranging these rocks around me, I spun around scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. But the forest was quiet, peaceful, even betraying no sign of the nocturnal activities that had taken place. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my camp. Whatever was going on here, I wanted no part of it. I'd hike back to the main trail and figure out my next move from there. As I was rolling up my tent, I heard it again, that soft, insistent whispering. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, beckoning me. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn towards the sound. I pushed through the underbrush branches, scratching at my face and arms. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out any words. It led me to another clearing, smaller than the one I'd camped in. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The clearing was filled with stone circles, dozens of them ranging from tiny rings the size of my palm to massive formations that must have taken multiple people to construct. And there, in the center of it all, was a symbol carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree, a crude circle with a line drawn through it. I approached the tree, my hand reaching out almost of its own accord to trace the carving. As my fingers touched the rough bark, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from behind me, a twig snapped. I whirled around my heart, pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Where its face should have been was only a smooth, blank expanse of skin. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face. Root threatened to trip me, but I kept going. I could hear it behind me moving with a speed that defied its awkward appearance. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that panicked flight, but eventually I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath, my legs shaking with exertion. A group of hikers stared at me in alarm. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. Taking in my wild appearance and terrified expression, I opened my mouth to explain, to warn them about what was in those woods. But as I turned to point back the way I'd come, I saw only peaceful forest, no sign of pursuit, no unnaturally tall figure, nothing. I got lost. I managed to stammer out, took a wrong turn off the trail. They nodded sympathetically, offering me water and a granola bar. As my breathing slowed and my panic receded, I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was it just fear and isolation playing tricks on my mind? But then, as the hikers were about to continue on their way, I saw one of them pause. He was looking at something on the ground just off the trail. My blood ran cold as I realized what it was, a small pile of rocks stacked neatly one on top of the other. Wonder who left this here? The hiker mused. I didn't stay to chat. I hiked out that day, pushing myself to exhaustion to reach the nearest town. I never went back to finish my hike, never told anyone the full story of what I'd seen. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear it again, that soft, insistent chanting. And I know that out there, deep in the woods where few people venture, something is waiting, something that builds circles of stone and carves ancient symbols into trees, something that watches and whispers and lures unsuspecting hikers off the beaten path. So if you're ever hiking in the wilderness and you come across a strange pile of rocks or hear whispers on the wind, remember my story. Don't investigate, don't try to understand. Just turn around and head back to civilization as fast as you can, because some things in nature aren't meant to be understood, only feared, and avoided it at all costs. And whatever you do, never, ever sleep in a place surrounded by stone circles, because you never know what might be there when you wake up for.